Without the grounding that we've established in Nietzsche's thought on metaphysics, on morality, on truth, and so on, one's interpretation of Nietzsche's grand pronouncements in his deepest thought experiments is fated to come up short. It's easy to come up with an oversimplified or a decontextualized view of Nietzsche's work. Without understanding the totality of his philosophy, you can't really understand Nietzsche's religion. And that's what we're primarily talking about in Season 2. Religious Nietzsche, or you might say artistic Nietzsche. The Nietzschean Religion as it's laid out in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I call it a religion, even though this will be controversial, because it is a new world interpretation which acts as a value superstructure that Nietzsche offers us. It's artistic because it's not born out of the will to truth. This is perhaps one of Nietzsche's most subtle and dangerous insights, although it can't be said to be his alone, and is somewhat ironically shared with all the mystics and theologians of the world, that the deepest meaning we seek cannot be derived by philosophical, scientific, or rational investigation. And this is why some modern religious types have respect, sometimes a grudging respect, for Nietzsche. But where Nietzsche departs from the traditional theologians and from the typical atheist is insofar as he's willing to follow an artistic process to construct a new religious superstructure. This is something that anyone within a traditional religion must, of course, reject. But an atheist committed to pure rationality must reject this also. Out of consistency, must reject this project. And so, while Nietzsche's insight, that our quest for meaning cannot be undertaken by reason alone, this may be rather unremarkable in and of itself, just in terms of how many great thinkers have put this idea forward, and the religions too. But his response to this problem sets him apart from almost all other philosophers, and perhaps helps to account for the legend that has grown up around his legacy today. Again, it may be controversial for me to suggest that Nietzsche has a religious project and that his work exists to some degree within the domain of the philosophy of religion, we might say. However, I would nevertheless affirm this assertion, and I think my justification for doing so is clear when we consider the designation of Nietzsche also as a moral philosopher. Even as Nietzsche calls himself an immoralist and calls his central character Zarathustra the annihilator of morality, and even as he says that he waged a campaign against morality in his work, and not just the popular morality, mind you, but the concept of objective morality itself, we can nevertheless see Nietzsche as a moral philosopher. In spite of all of this, he's inarguably engaged with the question or the questions surrounding human values, how these values motivate human action. His central project in moral philosophy is the revaluation of all values, a project in which no presumed moral axiom is held to be sacred, and the free spirit then reconstructs morality from the ground up, selecting values that one finds to be, in Nietzsche's case, commensurate with life, which is to say, will to power. So in spite of Nietzsche's attack on morality, by saying that all moral systems are contingent on historical and cultural factors, that all truths and all valuations are human, all too human, we might say, and thus not absolute, which means there's in fact no absolute moral perspective, Nietzsche nevertheless concerns himself with what we might call, in today's language, meta-ethics. The question, is there any way that we can determine which among these admittedly contingent moral systems is the best to hold? By what standard can we determine this? Nietzsche is deeply concerned with these questions and with, discussion of morality, criticism of morality, the reevaluation of morality in general. And so it's generally not controversial to say that Nietzsche is a moral philosopher. The reevaluation of values is obviously a moral project. But As such, let's apply the same standard and consider Nietzsche as a philosopher of religion. Nietzsche attacks religion, particularly the Christian religion, in the same way he attacks the conventional morality, by calling into question all metaphysical beliefs, all worlds beyond, all cosmologies and ontologies. Nietzsche attacks any claim of absolute religious truth and finds instead psychological or even physiological justifications for religious beliefs. And so, in short, Nietzsche's criticism of religion, it lies in the naturalistic explanation for mankind and for the world. This means that God, is dead, as we discussed in last season, that the belief in the Christian religions become unworthy of belief, and that the only world of value is instead the immediate world of perception and experience. Nietzsche, like with all moral claims, considers all these religious claims to be productions of the human mind, necessary fictions for the justification and the preservation of a certain way of life. And so through these religious notions, mankind enchanted the world, and there's always a moral, what would you say? There's always a moral and a metaphysic that are sort of united in that. But in full knowledge of this, Nietzsche nevertheless concerns himself with what we might call a meta-religion or a meta-religious question, in spite of all of his attacks upon religion. And so then we're asking a similar sort of question to the meta-ethical question. Is there any way that we can determine what kind of world-enchanting religious belief might be the best? By what standard can we determine, which type of religious doctrine is the best? In the same way that Nietzsche is concerned with the moral questions through a sort of meta-ethical lens, Nietzsche is concerned with the religious questions through a meta-religious lens. And so it's from this perspective we're now going to talk about the idea of eternal return. It's also known as the Eternal Recurrence. And sometimes, if you give the full title, the eternal return of the same events, the eternal recurrence of the same events. It's one of the most famous ideas of Nietzsche, and there are many valid ways to approach the idea, let me say at the outset. But I've chosen to approach it from the framework of this idea of eternal return as a meta-religious idea. Again, Nietzsche rejects religion. He's a firm atheist. He firmly believes that this immediate world is the only world we should invest value in. And this is the only life you or I will ever have. And yet, working from that initial framework of a naturalistic grounding, Nietzsche nevertheless dares to ask the question, can we enchant the world the way that the religions of the past did? All of man's idols are hollow, but we can nevertheless, hit on each idol with a tuning fork in order to hear what tone it chimes. Even if we deny the absolute reality of any of these religious claims, we can still evaluate them according to the standard of how well they capitulate to this total primacy of the natural world. A religion could be considered healthier if this type of enchantment of the world is in line with this total primacy of our, the primacy of our individually led human lives within this world. A religion could be healthy if it doesn't attempt to invest value elsewhere, or to the degree that it doesn't, right? So eternal return is the attempt to create a basis for such a healthy religion. And Nietzsche lays down eternal return as a sort of foundation in order to construct his religion from the ground up. Now, if you don't know what it is, I suppose I should say what it is before we go further. The idea of eternal return is that your life, exactly as you have lived it, and exactly as you will live it, is something that repeats endlessly and never ceases. When you die, your life repeats. You're without memory of this process, and you're created anew exactly as you are to go about living your life mostly in ignorance of this fact, unless, of course, you happen upon a book by Friedrich Nietzsche that clues you into the idea. But every time you're born, your life plays out in exactly the same way down to the last detail. There's no afterlife. There's nothing outside of this single life. At least for you, there's nothing. There's no rest from this life. The play begins again as soon as it's ended. It's an ever-repeating song, a circle, definitely enclosed, a circuit that you run upon endlessly. And having heard about the idea just now, you of course don't know for sure if this is true or not, because you never have any memory of having lived your life before. And that, this is the fate of all human beings, to ever repeat every detail of their lives in ignorance of this truth. Nietzsche records that this idea arrived with great force, as we described in the last episode of Season 1. He said the idea struck him 6,000 feet above man in time as he was walking along Lake Silvaplana in 1881. But he introduces this idea in its most fully articulated form in The Gay Science, Book 4. It's an infamous passage called The Greatest Weight, or at least that's how it's normally rendered in English. The phrase in German is das größte Schwergewicht. The word Schwergewicht means heavyweight, which could mean literally a heavy weight. It's also the same noun used for a heavyweight boxer. Another meaning to the term is to have, it could mean main emphasis. It could mean, an English term that we have that's similar is the word stress. You could say to somebody, I'm really stressed out, or you could say to somebody, I really have to stress what I'm about to say to you. This means to place a great emphasis on this part of what I'm saying. And so all these ideas give the title The Greatest Weight a very rich meaning. Nietzsche is saying that he's outlining the hardest possible challenge. It's a challenge in the sense of a burden. Yes, you could see it like that, the heaviest burden. But that's not the kind of metaphor Nietzsche likes to employ. It's perhaps better to consider it a challenge in the sense of an opponent one has to overcome or fight. This is like a heavyweight boxer you have to face. It's a challenge. Nietzsche wants you to see this challenge, this doubting thought, a gnawing, nagging, stressful thought, the most stressful thought, but it's something you can go and fight against and even defeat, even conquer. And so, but because the challenge is so terrifying and so daunting, it leads Zarathustra occasionally to talk about his fears surrounding the eternal recurrence as like the most abysmal thought. But by overcoming it, one gains the triumph over the hardest challenge known to mankind. One's beaten the greatest opponent. And so eternal return, paradoxically, nauseates and entices Zarathustra. It could be both a misery and a triumph, or rather, depending on how one handles the challenge, it could be either in absolute excess, right? Infinite excess, depending on how seriously you take it. But so Nietzsche, he talks about it, Gay Science, Book 4. Again, that's the book Sanctus Januarius that leads directly into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is aphorism number 341. And so without further ado, the greatest weight, or if I might translate it in spirit, if not literally, the toughest challenge. Quote, what if, some day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and everything, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal. End quote. So the challenge put to us is very clear. And I think if you take nothing more from this episode and simply want a quick explanation of eternal return, it would be this. This is a thought experiment, or you might say a mental exercise that you can put to yourself to bring before your mind's eye in order to raise the question of how invested you truly are into the value of your own life. Would you live the life you're living an endless number of times over? And if the answer is no, why not? What could you do in order to make your life worthy of being lived a million or, an infinite number of times over? So why aren't you doing that? I mean, and, obviously, if from the materialist perspective, a lot of us would say, well, I only get one. I only have one life to live, right? And even under that framework, you could raise the question seriously. Why aren't you living it to the fullest if you only get one? Nietzsche is still saying you only get one life to live. It's just you're going to live that one life over and over and over and over and over again, right? So the practical dimension of this aphorism and how I think anyone can seriously use it to consider or perhaps reconsider their own lives, this is the hardest challenge, because if one wholeheartedly accepts it, then they would have to conclude how they regard their own existence could vary from blessed to absolutely hellish, depending on how fully they're willing to commit to this principle and make their lives utterly worth it. Because the idea to be confronted with the prospect that one's life has been a failure or hasn't been worth living, and to consider that in light of the prospect of repeating it endlessly, that's disturbing, almost to the point of being paralyzing. And so to fully confront and take on this challenge, you have to truly love your life. You have to love your fate. So I quoted extensively from Charlie Huneman's essay, Nietzsche's Task, way back in episode 4 of the podcast. But here I want to bring in that essay once again, because his words are once again very helpful to understanding the eternal recurrence. And here Huneman explains what it is that Nietzsche is getting out of the eternal recurrence doctrine that is not achieved by the other religious or, philosophical beliefs that were available to him. Not by atheism, and just sort of generic atheism, we might say. Quote, "The true power of the idea," Nietzsche felt, "lay in the fact that the eternal recurrence was the only metaphysical view which permitted the world to redeem itself. The Christian postulation of heaven brings with it the belief that this world is valuable precisely because it is a prelude to something else, heaven. The Buddhist belief that consciousness can finally be extinguished reinforces the interpretation of conscious life as constant painful thirsting. The world is again something to get over." End quote. Just to jump in here, we may recognize the view of Schopenhauer in that view as well. Quote, "The futurist notion that there is progress in our inventions makes the present valuable only as a bridge to something else, the future. But if we say that this world leads only to itself, recurring again and again, without change or improvement of any kind, then there is nothing beyond this world that serves as its redemption. Our life is hemmed in on both sides, and only the world redeems the world." We might wonder whether we could get by on the cheap and insist that there is no heaven, no nirvana, no progress, and no recurrence. Why must there be recurrence in order for the world to redeem itself? Here lies the importance of the idea as a personal philosophical challenge for Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not want to allow himself the emotional and cognitive possibility of accepting his life in bad faith. That is, it would be easier to accept a life filled with myopia and migraines if one were confident that one will never have to suffer those pains again. But the real challenge is to accept one's life with the belief that the life will be lived again and again, just as it was, without a single departure from what has already happened. We cannot embrace that challenge unless we truly love our lives. End quote. So again, Huneman does a great job explaining the redemption that Nietzsche thought was served by eternal recurrence, the redemption of the world, and in a way his own life. You can also see the influence of Huneman's thinking on this and my thought. But again, this redemption comes with an intense demand. It's not an easy thing to love your life. And in fact, most people don't. And as Hühnemann alludes to for Nietzsche, with his chronic condition that caused him headaches, nausea, vomiting, throughout his entire life, perhaps it would be especially hard for Nietzsche to wrestle with the eternal affirmation of his life. So this personal challenge set before oneself is incredibly difficult. And so that kind of means that if this is going to be like a new form of religion, it's not a religion for everybody. And that's by design, actually. But we'll get to that in a moment. Nietzsche's not the one to invent eternal recurrence. And he's rather open about this fact. He says in a note from 1888, Will to Power, this is in the collection of notes, Will to Power, this is numbered 1066, quote, I've come across this idea in earlier thinkers, end quote. Although Nietzsche does go on to say, quote, every time it was determined by ulterior considerations, mostly theological, in favor of the creator spiritus, end quote. So Nietzsche earlier in this passage, in his notes, disregards the hypothesis that the world is created. He criticizes this explanation as a sort of linguistic confusion, a misapplied word, because the word creation it becomes sort of meaningless as a final explanation. He says that the problem is conceiving of a world that has a beginning. He writes that this is done, with an ulterior theological motive, as he says. What he's referring to here, I think, is that we can find some variation of the eternal recurrence idea throughout the ages in the myths and religions of various peoples. We have the idea of rebirth in the Buddhist and in the Hindu religions, both of which they don't really hold that your life repeats eternally exactly as it is, strictly as it is. But if you kind of zoom out in Hinduism, for example, they believe that there are these broad patterns of reality that repeat again and again and again over long processions of kalpas, right? So a kalpa, it's like to explain how long a kalpa is supposed to be in Hindu religious philosophy, there's like sayings, take like a silk scarf and, rub it against the side of a mountain once every year. And by the time, when that scarf finally erodes the mountain, right, the kalpa is still not even finished, right? These are the kinds of things that they say about kalpas. So a very long procession of time. And over those courses of time, it's not as if, again, your individual life repeats exactly as it is, but you're being reincarnated, and the kinds of lives you lead are, not really that remarkably different from each other. And this is sort of the part of the Buddhist argument for getting out of samsara. It's also mentioned in the Aeneid, the spirits in the underworld can drink the waters of forgetting, which is like the waters of Lethe, I believe, and then they're reincarnated into a new life. The Pythagoreans also held to a version of this, that they believe that events would repeat not within like a restart of all reality, but that events would repeat within known history itself. Nietzsche actually disagreed with this particular view of recurrence, and he says this in his essay, Use and Abuse of History for Life. Nietzsche wrote that the repeat of the same events within recorded history was absurd. But, nonetheless, we could say that the Pythagorean notion is at least a variation on this idea, and we might also consider, Heinrich Heine. He was a poet and writer who influenced Nietzsche, and he wrote, quote, according to the eternal laws governing the combinations of this eternal play of repetition, all configurations that have previously existed on this earth must yet again meet, attract, repulse, kiss, and corrupt each other again. End quote. So Nietzsche has many predecessors and many influences that he draws upon in coming to his own idea of the eternal recurrence of the same. But the fact that this is not a novel idea of Nietzsche's, but rather a doctrine he discovers among multiple myths and religions and writers, that I don't think that's a downside for Nietzsche's idea at all. I think for this meta-religious inquiry, Nietzsche actually, not only does he not need to innovate out of whole cloth, I think it's almost better if he doesn't. Nietzsche's doing what he does best, going Maybe that's why some of this idea and the profundity of this idea is what struck him in 1881 at Lake Silvaplana, but he'd clearly been exposed to some version of the idea of this cyclical view of these play of forces ever repeating. And, so he's going around sounding his tuning fork against all the different idols, right? And he discovers this idea, this idol, this one idol among all of them, that idea of the eternal repeat of the same, which occurs in all these different variations, if not in exactly the same form. And he becomes enamored with it. And so what is it about this idea that he becomes enamored with? Again, as we've said, it provides him with this justification, this redemption of his life. And it's in the form of facing this incredible challenge. And that kind of metaphor for life and that kind of approach to life is really what attracts Nietzsche. But there's more to it than that. And he talks about what need this doctrine fulfills for him in another note in Will to Power, and this is number 862. Quote, "A doctrine is required, strong enough to have the effect of breeding, strengthening the strong, paralyzing, and breaking the world-weary." End quote. So because Nietzsche said breeding, I think it's worth clarifying here, because Nietzsche's conception of the value of a doctrine may be somewhat outdated in our modern terms, so let me put it into more timely terminology. Nietzsche is considering how culture might affect the development and the education of a people, or we might say of a generation. These are the same concerns he held even from the beginning of his philosophical career, when he wrote the Untimely Meditations essays, how culture and education and historical education work to shape and mold the upcoming generations. And why is this? Because it brings out certain things in them. It nurtures certain things. And his concerns always with how these societal forces ought to be working to make us better, not to simply, accumulate a bunch of trivial, superficial knowledge, or adorn ourselves with all these external pretensions of superficial culture. Nietzsche believes that culture is a social force that imbues us with this collective net of consciousness that allows us to interpret and understand reality. And that's what education should be cultivating. And culture itself should not be mere affectations or etiquette or mere technical knowledge. Rather, culture should be understood as something that shapes us and gives us our deepest beliefs about reality. And, whether you succeed in reality or not, whether your society in the long term flourishes or not, Nietzsche believes can be affected by those beliefs. And so this is not, I want to stress here, because I maybe have not made it explicitly clear throughout the podcast, Nietzsche's form of analysis is neither of, history and politics. It's neither a Marxist material analysis, nor is it a Hegelian, Hegelian dialectic, which is, in the form of idealism. Nietzsche does accept that culture is a potent and important force that does actually cash out in the world at large. And so he thinks this is important. And that's all true. He also just includes perhaps like a genetic element in there with the term breeding. That's a little outdated. He still holds these Lamarckian beliefs. It's the late 19th century. He believed things such as capabilities and intellectual skills can be passed down through genetics, which is why he tends to frame things in terms of breeding. It's basically one of the side effects of that would be that culture can be passed down, right? And so, Lamarck's ideas have mostly been dismissed by modern science, so maybe we can set a literal interpretation of this unpublished note aside. The important thing I want to drive home, he's thinking about this meta-religious project on a society-wide level, and he's looking for a doctrine that fulfills the function of uplifting those who thrive in the world. That's the quality that he wishes to nurture, that he wishes culture to nurture. And he also says his goal is to hasten the decline of the world-weary. And so remember, Much of Nietzsche's orientation morally is opposed to the Christian pathology that sees life as a thing to be redeemed from and sees life as essentially tainted by suffering of no real value. Nietzsche's religion must, of course, align with the inverse, that the celebration of life and the celebration of the world. And not that the meek and the downtrodden should inherit the earth, right? But that those who flourish upon this earth are the ones who should inherit it. And so he would say it's to be a Dionysian religion rather than a Christian one. And so, and maybe you're still wondering if religion is the correct term for what I mean. Some might say that a better term is spirituality. I think there's a fundamental problem with this, though, because spirituality is etymologically based on the word spirit, obviously. Spirit has a rich etymological history in the Western world, and so it's loaded with all this philosophical and psychological baggage. And I would argue that Nietzsche, he would find most of those connotations problematic. And he makes it clear in the Antichrist as well, that spirit, Geist, is the exact thing he is in opposition to. Why? Because spirit is separated from the flesh in the Western mind. Spirit's defined as immaterial, non-material, non-physical, something defined in the negative, something untethered to the natural world. And so in theological terms, the world of spirit is always a greater world than this one. In Nietzsche's Revaluation, he wants the exact opposite, as we've talked about. And so in German, in Geist, too, the word we translate as spirit, it has a connotation of also meaning the mind or the intellect. It's effectively the conscious mind seen as this immaterial thing. And there's a very important link there to the concept of the Christian soul. And so the philosophical connotation of Geist is usually of the conscious intellect as separate from the natural and historical and the embodied world. And so what Nietzsche is attacking is spirituality. He says in the Antichrist that investing value into the concept of spirit is the definition of what is decadent. And so the separation from the body, from the instincts, from the natural world, that's all weakness to Nietzsche. And so spirituality is not a good word for Nietzsche's project here. Whereas meanwhile, let's look at the word religion. Originally from Latin religare, which means to bind, or later an oath, obligation, a duty, a familial bond. So in invoking the term religion, I'm referring to the bonds created by religion, bonds between ideas, between people, between generations. So we can see the parallel to the collective net of consciousness that I'm arguing culture is. Nietzsche is also, indeed, he's linking together many ideas from many different peoples, and his goal is to create a new understanding of ourselves and a new understanding of our place in the world. And I think this qualifies as a religion by that definition. But of course, the term evolved. And by the Middle Ages, it emerges into Old English and Old French to mean like a way of life under vows. And so my argument here, I think that this religion of eternal return is Nietzsche's attempt at creating a new vow, a new oath that designates the free spirit. This is an oath that you can take. Again, I'm not solely trying to be provocative or subversive by suggesting that Nietzsche's, has a religious project here, but I think this perhaps unusual description of Nietzsche's idea is warranted to get across the point. Nietzsche wants to vow to ourselves to take an oath to remain faithful to the earth, as he puts it in Zarathustra, which means remain faithful to this life, to this body, and to this world. Remain faithful insofar as you don't chase after other values and other worlds and other lives. It's literally a vow of intellectual chastity, not to be seduced by other worlds. A complete inversion of the Christian understanding of a word like chastity or purity, right? Which sees the world of spirit as pure, and this physical world, embodied world, where we're flesh and bone, that's impure. So flip that around. With the oath that we swear by taking on the toughest challenge of eternal return, Nietzsche attempts to establish a worldly religion. So Nietzsche's philosophy is a worldly philosophy. His religion's a worldly religion. And so Nietzsche's willingness to author a doctrine without a philosophical basis, out of a religious need, or we might say an artistic need, doesn't mean that Nietzsche's being cynical or that he's writing things that he doesn't believe. He writes in the passage above about the ulterior motives and theological motives, how those shape the minds of those who put forward religious doctrines, which indicates that there's a self-awareness of what he's doing. And with that understanding, with that self-awareness, he nevertheless puts forward a religious doctrine. And so the reason why I say that he's not being knowingly dishonest or misleading, I would put forward the argument that Nietzsche really deeply believes that this world and this life is the entire horizon of our existence, and that he thinks that we therefore need to spiritualize it to make it of the highest value, of transcendent value. And the way that he notices that all of these past religions have enchanted the world is by, spiritualize the world, we might say, is by eternalizing. And so I think he bases his doctrine on a firm, sincere belief in the natural world and the primacy of that world, and also in the belief that that world is, in all its essential characteristics, described by this principle of will to power. And so, let's look at a couple more of the notes, because these are what really, flesh out this idea. He writes in his unpublished notes that this world, defined by will to power, would seem to pose an inherent problem for any view of the world which includes a beginning or an end or fixed categories of being. This is also in that same note, 1066, quote, "The world exists. It is not something that becomes, not something that passes away. Or rather, it becomes, it passes away, but it has never begun to become and never ceased from passing away." End quote. We do have to be a little careful here, actually, because these are his unpublished notes, and I'm not trying to use them to advance the argument that this is a settled interpretation, of Nietzsche's formal opinion on the matter. I'm not trying to say Nietzsche was making a metaphysical argument, or that he believed any of these statements were true in the sense that, say, a scientific statement is true. If anything, I think quite the opposite. Nietzsche, as he usually does, is questioning all these supposedly settled world interpretations that are really easy for us materialists to accept, right? So secularists and materialists tend to spend very little time questioning the deep questions about the origins and meaning behind the existence of reality. And I think it's very easy to just accept a series of, very neat responses that allow us to just not have to think about it anymore, right? And it can lead to a kind of epistemic arrogance that leads us to look at ideas like eternal return and simply say, well, that's ridiculous. Where's the evidence? Right? It's like, well, where's the evidence that such a thing as an uncaused cause can exist? And yet, how many people will tell you if you ask them, well, how did reality begin? Well, Big Bang. Well, okay, so that's the very beginning? That would make it an uncaused cause. And then, that's where you get into the Big Bang might not have been the beginning of everything, but it was the beginning of our universe that exists. It's like, okay, well, if we're talking about the beginning of reality, then Big Bang's not the beginning. The Big Bang's when time began. Well, what happened before that? Now, of course, some will say it's not coherent to speak of things happening before time began, or to speak of what cause and effect was like before time began, and the Big Bang, it's the beginning of time. So I think that's all fine as an argument in defense of the Big Bang as a possibility. Yeah, that you don't have to have a final explanation for all those things. That doesn't mean the Big Bang isn't possible just because you can't explain it. But it's not a good argument for suggesting that this was a definite causeless cause that started reality. We can acknowledge that we don't need to have those arguments about everything to talk about the event itself and discuss it as a scientific phenomenon. But we also have to admit that it's not explanatory. If eventually we have to say that we don't know what caused it, or we have to say it's not sensible to ask about what caused it. Okay. Well, then you need to take on more of an attitude of epistemic humility, that no current scientific theory offers a final explanation of reality or demonstrates a definite beginning point. We don't know. And I mean, consider, suppose there's the fecund universes theory. Suppose there are many universes and we have this infinite multiverse. Then consider the flippancy with which people say the Big Bang was the start of everything. In the multiverse, the Big Bang would be an infinitesimally insignificant event considered from the perspective of the totality. It's not the beginning of anything, except one universe out of an infinity. So is it really meaningful to call that the beginning? And so maybe that's a bit of a sidetrack, but I think it's important to I don't know, bring all these things into the open that are probably rattling around in the back of some people's minds, because I probably think in a similar way to some of you. But this passage would indicate the world as Nietzsche sees it. He would agree that it's something that stretches back into infinity, something that goes on forever and ever, arising and passing away in sort of a grand cosmic cycle, but it's not something that itself came into being. Somewhat of a Hindu view of metaphysics, we might say, or a Heraclitean view. But skipping further down in the same passage, Wolt's Power 1066, quote, "If the world could in any way become rigid, dry, dead, nothing, or if it could reach a state of equilibrium, or if it had a kind of goal that involved duration, immutability, the once and for all, in short, speaking metaphysically, if becoming could resolve itself into being, or into nothingness, then this state must have been reached, but it has not been reached," end quote. And so, how to explain this? So let's look at the way Schopenhauer talks about gravity as a way of explaining what Nietzsche's talking about here. Schopenhauer at one point considers how all the manifestations of the will can never reach satisfaction. He considers everything in reality a manifestation of the will, including things like the laws of physics, right? So the will is this eternal character of being. The willing has to always go on and on, so these manifestations of the will are never satisfied, and this applies to human beings as much as animals, as much as the laws of physics. And so, for example, if we apply this Schopenhauerian interpretation of the world to gravity, it would indicate, gravity wills to accumulate all mass into a single undivided totality, which would include all mass. It's the will of gravity. And that's indicated by the behavior of gravity, for mass to accumulate to bigger and bigger chunks of mass. So effectively on some level what Nietzsche is saying, if gravity could accumulate all mass into a single totality, it would have done so already. And therefore, that goes for every single physical force or law that we observe. If there was a final end, a once and for all, to all the various forces that exist in our world, that exist in this endless conflict and play of forces against each other, if there was some sort of end goal that was achievable, it would have been achieved because, there's been an infinite duration of time for it to do so. If we accept Nietzsche's idea that there's no beginning, or, and so, if the world had a goal that involved duration and a once and for all, as he says, that state would have been reached. And, so what Schopenhauer says is that, therefore, when he's talking about gravity and all these other forces, he says the reason why it's never reached is because they all sort of cancel each other out. Like gravity's stopped from accumulating the totality of all mass together because it's stopped by the force of, impenetrability or whatever. We don't have to acknowledge any of that as scientifically valid, to just think about it in terms that Nietzsche's thinking about it, that all of the various forces that exist in reality, none of them can quote unquote resolve themselves. If there's been an infinite passage of time already and neither absolute being nor absolute nothingness has been attained, which is maybe to put it in more in the realm of the metaphysical problem he's talking about, such things we can safely say then will never come to pass. It's an endless creation and destruction in a cyclical pattern, as though the play endlessly goes on. And, to invoke Hinduism again, there's the word, I believe it's lila, which means play in the sense of a drama, but also playing. And that there's that idea that is sort of, this is the manifest reality that we all experience, is the play of a great sort of cosmic being, we might say. And Nietzsche talked about that as well in his lectures on the pre-Platonics when he was speaking about Heraclitus, Aeon, the boy god of the zodiac, endlessly playing his games of creation and destruction, right? Innocently manifesting and then crushing all of these phenomena of creation. Although I think we have to note, it's just this personification of the great play of forces of reality that Nietzsche rejects. He rejects the image of the world that renders it into something like a personal being. He dabbled in that kind of metaphysical image, as we said, when he talked about that in his lectures, or in Birth of Tragedy. He wrote of the primordial pain and contradiction, which manifests itself into all things. He wrote of man as this wayward son of nature carved away from the natural oneness. And he referenced in that same book the veil of Maya being ripped away during the Dionysian rituals, which is a direct reference to a Hindu concept. The veil of Maya is this veil that clouds your perception. You as this ordinary being, it clouds your perception that you're this part of this oneness of the Godhead. But Nietzsche went on to repudiate these types of ideas and rejected the idea of a personified nature, or of a reality, that the reality was the Brahman that must live and experience the world within its creation. This idea that, Schopenhauer had been influenced by. Nietzsche rejects that. Nietzsche even differs with the Taoist philosophers in the same respect, in that he's not even willing to consider the universe as a living being or as an organism, even if it's not necessarily a personal being. He's not even on board with an impersonal but living being. And I'm basing this on the Gay Science number 109. It's an aphorism that could be seen to contain some of the precursory ideas to the passage, The Greatest Weight, that he would write in a later book of the Gay Science. But in Gay Science 109, he writes, quote, "Let us beware of thinking that the world is a living being. Where should it expand? On what should it feed? How could it grow and multiply? Let us beware of positing generally and everywhere anything as elegant as the cyclical movements of our neighboring stars. The astral order in which we live is an exception. This order and the relative duration that depends on it have again made possible an exception of exceptions, the formation of the organic. The total character of the world, however, is in all eternity chaos, in the sense not of a lack of necessity, but a lack of order, arrangement, form, beauty, wisdom, and what other names there are for our aesthetic anthropomorphisms. Judged from the point of view of our reason, unsuccessful attempts are, by all odds, the rule. The exceptions are not the secret aim, and the whole music box repeats eternally its tune, which may never be called a melody." End quote. So, it is a very Heraclitean view that from the ultimate perspective, there is no duration. Parmenides says that change is an illusion, and in fact, motion is an illusion. Heraclitus says that duration is the illusion, and that change is eternal. And so, perhaps the takeaway here, all of our world pictures are rendered through faith. No one possesses a final explanation for the bedrock of reality. No examination of any set of laws or patterns will ever bring us to that explanation, whether by using what limited, pitiful scientific knowledge we have, whether we proceed via our fallible reason or with our irrational intuitions. Because frankly, to be a bit reductive, we have the problem of induction and the problem of the contingency of all human knowledge on our perspective and just the limitations of our cognition. That mean that we don't ever get to absolute certainty about questions like this. And the people who claim to have it through faith, right? And so Nietzsche, as such, he realizes that his world picture of this world, of this eternal play of forces that eternally recurs, that's no more or less valid than anyone else's in terms of the objective truth. But that doesn't mean that it isn't authentically his world picture. And I think that's clear from the passage that we just read from the Gay Science, that it's in line with the thinking throughout his work, that our categories and conceptualizations for understanding the world are these aesthetic anthropomorphisms, and that beyond our falsifications of the world into these categories, there's this eternal flux which is beyond our understanding, chaos. And it makes a kind of intuitive sense to him that this chaos must eternally repeat because it's infinite, but it doesn't resolve itself into being or nothingness. So the cyclical reality is the only thing that makes sense to Nietzsche. And so given an infinite number of repetitions, everything will repeat exactly as it is an infinite number of times over. Nietzsche's argument for the value of his world picture, though, is not at all in the sense of objective truth. It's in how the eternal return will serve as the doctrine for the elevation of mankind. That's the only measurement we have in Nietzsche's view as to the worth of religious doctrine. If we start from the position of the world as the locus of all value, then Nietzsche's religion will affirm and spiritualize the world, and that will be the standard he'll measure. So that means that the standard he'll measure by, we'll say. And so this doctrine must recognize what the world is. It has to recognize the character of the world as this place of becoming where all life is striving to overcome what it previously was, to become greater. And so if his doctrine is to affirm the world, it has to affirm this as well. And so that's sort of the justification for why he is using that standard to evaluate what a healthy religion is. And he writes candidly about this in a note in Will to Power 1053, quote, "My philosophy brings the triumphant idea of which all other modes of thought will ultimately perish. It is the great cultivating idea. The races that cannot bear it stand condemned. Those who find it the greatest benefit are chosen to rule." End quote. Again, let's understand races here in terms of nations, peoples, groups of people. Culture might be a better word in the sense that we talked about cultures earlier. So Nietzsche thus links eternal recurrence in some sense to his moral project here, and it's the doctrine that's not just a healthier illusion for enchanting the world. The same token, it's a doctrine that will facilitate Nietzsche's moral project to reevaluate our morality in accord with the will to power. And so as for how this doctrine takes its toll upon those who are unable to truly accept and love their lives, Nietzsche has his ideas about this as well, and we can find it in Will to Power number 55, and this is a note from 1887. Quote, "Duration coupled with an in vain, without aim and end, is the most paralyzing thought. Let us think this thought in its most terrible form. Existence as it is, without meaning or aim, yet recurring inevitably without any finale of nothingness, the eternal recurrence." End quote. And so I think it's clear from this, it seems the idea is just as terrifying to Nietzsche, right? I mean, it would terrify anyone on some level. But he's willing to put it to himself as a challenge. I guess I'm just trying to say here, he doesn't see it as a trivial thing. Oh, I'm above the worries about the eternal recurrence. No, he feels it. But so what we see here, it's the meta-religious grounding for a new mode of life, Nietzsche's worldly religion, and the point is to strengthen or enliven, and then on the other side of that coin, weaken and paralyze. Every metaphysic is immoral after all. And so to me, this passage, it really hammers home the idea is not something Nietzsche wished to remain merely a thought experiment. Even the term thought experiment makes me somewhat weary because it's such clinical philosophical language. I mean, a thought experiment is something you do which is like a function of detached reason, a scenario that you consider from afar, something simplified down to almost an absurdity, like, the absurdity of the trolley problem. The thought experiment is something purely imagined and intellectual. And again, eternal recurrence can be used in that way as a thought experiment, but perhaps if we want it to hold more relevance for our own lives, we could consider it rather than a thought experiment as a sort of mental exercise. Even if we don't want to take that metaphysical leap, right? But the way a Buddhist practices mindfulness or the way a Stoic practices negative visualization. And Nietzsche himself seemed to suggest the use of eternal return as a sort of exercise in thought. And this is in Will to Power 1065, notebooks from 1887 through 1888, March of 1888. So Nietzsche here, he compares how one might use the eternal recurrence as a sort of mental exercise. He compares it to another popular story that people use as a personal reminder or as a moral. Nietzsche in this note references the famous story of a king who asks a wise man for a gift that will allow him to find happiness in sad times and sadness during happy times. The wise man then gives him a ring which says, "This too shall pass." And Nietzsche then contrasts this story with his idea of eternal return. I dug around a bit for the origin of the story because I have heard it before. And to see Nietzsche quote it, it made me a bit curious as to its origins because I wondered, of the authenticity of this story and how old it was really. The best I could figure about this story is that it seems to be a literary legend or a fable, possibly originating with Attar of Nishapur, possibly originating with the poet Rumi. Either way, it was then repeated over and over again by writers and poets throughout the ages. Funnily enough, I found an instance in which it was cited by Abraham Lincoln. And so this is a quote from President Lincoln, September 30th, 1859, explaining the story. Quote, "It is said an Eastern monarch once charged his wise men to invent him a sentence to be ever in view, which should be true and appropriate in all times and situations. They presented him the words, 'And this too shall pass away.' How much it expresses, how chastening in the hour of pride, how consoling in the depths of affliction." End quote. And sorry, I didn't do a Lincoln voice there. Apparently Lincoln historically had a very shrill voice, which is funny because he's like a noted orator. Or, maybe that's just a myth. Let me know. Leave me a comment if that's not true. But I love this quotation. It makes clear how Lincoln is operating within the framework of the Christian moral system, and the mental practice of thinking this too shall pass is therefore revealed as being very much in line with the Christian moral system, and thus in how it stands in contrast with Nietzsche's eternal return. And so it's really a wonderful contrast. It's necessary to the Christian that we be consoled in the depths of affliction. Well, that's obvious from everything we know about Christianity, right? It's the religion of the sick, the sinner, the afflicted, the dying. But furthermore, if we remember the master and slave opposing moralities, in our genealogy of our morality, the Christian or slave morality is also opposed to, it's the pride of the master is something it's always uncomfortable with. And so it's important to the Christian we have something to check our own pride, even in times of triumph. The importance of this capacity for self-abnegation at all times, humility at all times, always keeping in mind the hard times that are in the future, rather than embracing happiness now. And so this story, as I pointed out, it's usually vaguely sourced to being an Eastern story, usually an unnamed Eastern monarch, but it fits so perfectly within the Christian moral reality that plenty of Westerners make reference to it. And so, anyway, Nietzsche references the story, and this is in a note in Will to Power 1065, and it contrasts with the power of the mental exercise that we could do with eternal recurrence. So, quote, A certain emperor always bore in mind the transitoriness of all things, so as not to take them too seriously and to live at peace among them. To me, on the contrary, everything seems far too valuable to be so fleeting. I seek an eternity for everything. Ought one to pour the most precious salves and wines into the sea? My consolation is that everything that has been is eternal. The sea will cast it up again. End quote. So I think this is a great example of how the medicine for the many might not be the medicine for the few, and vice versa. This empowering mental exercise for the downtrodden person, is to consider this too shall pass. And if, someone's downtrodden, not just materially downtrodden, but downtrodden in spirit too, they might not only need to bring this to mind during the hard times, they might need the phrase when they succeed. Because you don't want to ever take too much joy in the moment, right? And so we see how Christianity and Christian-oriented beliefs like this always try to lessen the joy that we could feel. You don't want to have, you don't want to be too proud in your own successes because that's just going to lead to feelings of guilt later. And I don't know, keeping one's focus on the suffering that is to come as a way of cheapening the joy of the moment. I call it Christian because of the way Nietzsche describes Jesus and the Antichrist, as one who suffers from every sensation, trembles at every sensation, everything strikes too deep. So the person who always has to focus on this too shall pass, that to me is trembling at every experience. You're always trembling at every high and every low, right? And so the Nietzsche, his mental exercise, on the contrary, is that he wants everything to be eternal, and so we'll call that a Dionysian orientation towards reality. Everything that has been in my life is eternal. Everything that will be is also eternal. This is the kind of attitude that is only appropriate for somebody who's just absolutely in love with life, to the point they'll even gamble on the eternity of their future, because who knows what that'll be and all the sufferings of that. But for the sake of the happiness I've already experienced, I'll take all of the future being eternal too. And so, again, this contrast makes clear how Nietzsche is not of a kind with the other atheistic philosophers who ultimately have to give in to the Christian idea of the fleetingness of everything in this world, right? I mean, obviously the Christians listening may say, well, we have our eye on eternity too. We just believe in the eternity of the other world, the spiritual world. I shouldn't have to say any more about that and why Nietzsche is completely in rejection of that. The other option for not us atheists is to throw in all of our hopes with dogmatic scientism and these essentialized, simplistic doctrines of being, of cause and effect, and so on, which deep down we all know doesn't really explain anything. And so this is Nietzsche in his notes here that I've been reading. It's quite fun because I think a lot of his considerations actively resist these attempts to simplify reality and dismiss the mystery of reality. But Nietzsche, I believe, I think he realized that if eternal return were allowed to remain something merely in the domain of thought experiments, if it were allowed to remain mere philosophy, it would be therefore only of concern to the philosophers and the academics. And that's not how ideas have historically acquired power throughout history. If we're being serious about how ideas begin to acquire power among the populace, it's because they begin to spread mimetically, from human being to human being via linguistic communication, by modeling behaviors, by indoctrinating one's children. That's a big one. The ideas that acquire power in this way, they're not what we call philosophical, typically, but religious. And so when Nietzsche is talking about how he requires a doctrine, he doesn't mean a philosophical doctrine. He is looking for a religious one. And so we might say, in the same way that if the idea of hell were a mere thought experiment, right? So suppose you knew nothing of eternal damnation. Suppose that the idea of hell had never been innovated by any religion. Maybe in this alternate reality we're imagining. Maybe we have religions, but they simply don't have the concept of hell. Then suppose somebody told you of a philosophical thought experiment in which you consider the possibility of a place where those who do bad things are eternally punished for their, moral choices on earth. That could be quite possibly a useful thought experiment for bringing to light whether you truly believe you've acted morally in your life or not. Or all sorts of things. This idea, though, would not be of concern to most people. It would only be of concern to the kinds of brainy people who go around posing thought experiments to one another. And even then, only of a passing concern, right? It would be like the trolley problem. So, something interesting that people of a certain, set of interests might talk about, but it wouldn't reshape lives. It wouldn't have any moral implications for society, just like the trolley problem really doesn't. And so consider instead the reality that we live in. The idea of hell exists in reality in our society, or the belief in it exists in reality. The idea of hell is genuinely believed by many people, and it has been for millennia. And in fact, it's not among the brainy philosophical types that the religious idea of hell is, most common. It's more widely found in the general population among common people, and this belief has shaped whole societies. And so that's the type of belief that Nietzsche wants to engender, not a mere thought experiment, and not even just a mental exercise, and not a philosophical argument. He wants to create a new religious meme. And so, in this understanding of the power of religion, I think I should bring up, he puts this forward in Will to Power, number 144. These are the notebooks from 1855. Quote, "Moralities and religions are the principal means by which one can make whatever one wishes out of man, provided one possesses superfluity of creative forces and can assert one's will over long periods of time, in the form of legislation, religions, and customs." End quote. There's also, another passage where he talks about philosophers as, a real true philosopher being a commander and a legislator. Again, a sort of awareness of this bedrock of fundamental ideas being the root of all cultures, and thus the philosopher actually being a very powerful figure in that respect, to the extent that he can actually influence that. So, again, though, Nietzsche, so he sees his own rendering of universal existence, right? The eternal return rendering. This world of becoming that eternally recurs. That cannot be meaningfully compared or contrasted with other religions according to the truth value, since none of the existing world pictures have a more or less, definite truth element to them than Nietzsche's idea does. And so he has the meta-religious principle in mind while crafting his doctrine, and so he's looking for something that is going to make something out of mankind. As he says, the principle means we can make whatever we wish out of mankind. And so he embarks on this project to cultivate the healthiest religion based on a central mimetic idea. That idea would be eternal return, and so he wants this not to simply be a mental exercise, but to win hearts and minds and shape man into something the way the hell doctrine did, right? That's another. So rather than something like hell or heaven or reincarnation or all these things, Nietzsche wants to offer us this alternative idea. They're all on the same level in terms of their objective truth value. He's just saying, what about this one? But he has to then, infuse that idea into a work. And so Nietzsche's prophet that he creates for this is Zarathustra. He then appears in the work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is written in a literary style consciously meant as an imitation of the Christian Bible. So Nietzsche has the daring to actually try to create a new religion as a means of spreading his new value system. And Zarathustra and his preachings are what Nietzsche calls his weapon for waging war against all of the weakness that he sees in the current society and culture. If his set of memes, if his set of valuations can begin to replicate in the minds and hearts of Europe, maybe this worldly religion can become an antidote to counterbalance Christianity. And so he writes in another note, 1054, This is notebooks from 1885 to 1886. Quote, "The greatest of struggles, for this a new weapon is needed. The hammer, to provoke a fearful decision, to confront Europe with the consequences, whether its will wills destruction, prevention of reduction to mediocrity, rather destruction," end quote. So we're seeing there's a moral element, there's a political element to all of this. But remember, Nietzsche ultimately doesn't believe in historical progress. He doesn't believe his actions are justified by the future. In fact, the rejection of historical progress as such is implied by the eternal recurrence idea, insofar as one genuinely accepts it. This is part of the tragic view of life and the tragic engagement with life. Nietzsche is acting in a way such that he can say, he attempted against all odds to sow the seeds of healthy values within the European soil, right? Or however he wants to say it. Whether this ultimately works out or not, it doesn't really matter. He's doing it because it is the quote-unquote good thing to do, according to his own conception of good, regardless of the potential future consequences of such a project. And so, as much as I've attempted to make Nietzsche's religious and cultural project coherent within this tragic and anti-historicist philosophy, it's clear to see that within his unpublished notes and within the background of his thought, he did entertain notions like quote-unquote breeding, or bringing forth in history a stronger, better Europe, a better society. I don't think it's damning or fatal for his ideas that he may have had conflicting feelings, right? I think it's only human. The greater good that Zarathustra's religion serves accords with Nietzsche's conception of the good as he lays out in the Antichrist. Good is the feeling that resistance is being overcome, the feeling of power increasing, of the will to power increasing. And that's why in that note he says it's the weapon to destroy mediocrity. Expose whether the modern will wills nothing, as in whether the modern will is actually nihilistic. What does he mean by that? Well, there are a great number of people, possibly the majority, who, if presented with the eternal recurrence, would will for nothingness instead of life within this endless repetition. Many people would choose nothingness over the eternalization of their lives. And so this doctrine is therefore the mediocrity killer. And that's a good thing because, mediocrity is one of the worst things for a culture. But let's suppose the eternal recurrence doctrine is true. Mediocrity becomes something much worse than mediocrity as we might conceive of it now. Imagine being endlessly mediocre. Mediocrity becomes almost intolerable. It's one thing to have an endless existence, which is particularly or extremely bad, right? At least in that case, you can say they're exemplary in some respect, right? Like Jesus suffered from life as no one else suffered from it. As that's Nietzsche's reading of him in the Antichrist. So there's something extraordinary about Jesus's life, even in spite of the fact that it's a life of suffering. Even if your life is especially bad, at least in that way, it's special. So, extreme experiences in the mix of your life, that always produces interesting characters and great individuals. But endless mediocrity, it's just contemptible in every way. An endless existence of bland boredom. Can you imagine anything worse? And so I think we can justifiably say that the prospect of eternal return ever taking hold as like a sincerely held religious notion, as this religious meme, might be unthinkable for precisely the reasons why Nietzsche finds such a doctrine so attractive. The majority will simply not, they will not like this, they will not find this concept agreeable, and so they won't believe it. It doesn't gladden the heart. And so I think this is another meaning for why Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a book for all and none. It's the reason why Nietzsche must cloak his metaphysical doctrine in symbols and metaphorical language, included among a whole, panoply of enticing and insightful and thrillingly dangerous teachings of Zarathustra. Another aspect to this, I really hope I've hammered home so far, we should take care to note that eternal return is not something that we should regard as a scientific hypothesis. And if it's not clear enough by now, this is not something which Nietzsche necessarily arrived at by scientific considerations. Although, on the other hand, it's probably worth saying, I don't think he thought it was an anti-scientific idea either. It's worth a look at a few of these notes where he considered the idea from that angle. Again, didn't publish any of these, but Nietzsche did experiment somewhat with the possibility of eternal return being verifiable by the scientific method. He postulated in Will to Power 1063, for example, quote, "The law of the conservation of energy demands eternal recurrence," end quote. And so perhaps this is because of how he was influenced by the work of Boscovich and some of the other alternate models of the world, alternate models to atomism. That maybe he had these ambitions of eventually finding some sort of evidence that would justify eternal return from a scientific angle. But ultimately, I think Nietzsche recognized that such a task was doomed from the very start, because you can never really justify a metaphysical position with physical evidence. You can posit all these ideas, but, and you can posit ideas metaphysically and even compare with how they intuitively reveal or explain or help us understand or come to grips with the world or with the human experience. But there's no experiment that you can run that can ever disprove a metaphysical or religious claim. And there's no way you could ever run an experiment to verify or to falsify eternal return. But Boscovich in particular is important. It's part of why I brought him up. In Will to Power 1066, this is a note I've gone back to a couple times, Nietzsche alludes to the work of Boscovich insofar as the way he describes the world, writing, quote, "If the world may be thought of as a certain definite quantity of force and as a certain definite number of centers of force, it follows that in the great dice game of existence, it must pass through a calculable number of combinations. In infinite time, every possible combination would at some time or another be realized. More, it would be realized an infinite number of times," end quote. The most important point, I think, about the scientific assessment of eternal recurrence, excuse me, the most important thing is that it doesn't seem to hold up mathematically. Judging whether this is true or not, it's far above my pay grade, but at the very least, Walter Kaufmann seems to believe that George Simmel more or less put that baby to bed. The way that Simmel argues this is fascinating, to say the least, but again, I'm not really qualified to explain it. Basically, to make what Simmel says clear as best I can in plain terms, eternal recurrence is just simply not necessitated by a finite amount of mass or energy existing in these states for an infinite amount of time, even assuming that the universe will continue for an infinite amount of time and won't suffer heat death due to entropy and would infinitely continue with the same amount of energy. We have no reason, even given a lot of assumptions, that we would see beings and events recur exactly as they were. Perhaps we can forgive some of the excesses of thought in the man's unpublished notes. And to his credit, Nietzsche tends to present eternal recurrence as a question rather than an answer. And even in these explorations into the scientific side of things, it does feel like he's more questioning than just dogmatically accepting things. But on the other hand, there's like a glaring counterexample to this, which is more or less the entirety of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he's writing in religious terms. And we would, of course, argue that Zarathustra is not literally a prophet. Nietzsche is not literally claiming he is some sort of supernatural inspiration. And once again, this is a naturalistic religion. It's a worldly religion. But Nietzsche nevertheless reached for a religious doctrine and felt compelled to preach one. And so this is something that Kaufmann criticizes him for in his book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, page 332, where he writes that Nietzsche, quote, turns a profound and valid insight into an exclusive doctrine. And he might be criticized in the very words he used to pass judgment on Christianity. He transformed the symbolic into crudities. Kaufmann quotes there from Will to Power 170 from the section on the Christian religion. But back to the text. Yet his doctrine of eternal recurrence is not an arbitrary antithesis to the Christian conception. Nietzsche returns to the world picture of an era that had not yet felt the impact of Micah or Isaiah, nor experienced how the festivals of the eternal periodicity of life are changed into celebrations of God's deeds. He returns to the visions of Pythagoras, Heraclitus, the Stoics, and the Buddhists, seeing no alternative to the conception of history as the development of time of the one God's will, and convinced that contemporary mechanism was still founded on the biblical assumption of an absolute beginning and end of events. End quote. I think everything he says there about Nietzsche's rejection of mechanism and why he rejects it is dead on. But I think for all of Kaufman's concern with the presentation of eternal recurrence as a doctrine, making it a, quote, crudity, I think Kaufman misses the point of what Nietzsche was trying to do, because Kaufman is trying to make Nietzsche sensible, right? He's trying to make him a rational philosopher, which was useful to do given the stereotypes of Nietzsche at the time, but I don't think Kaufman was willing to admit that Nietzsche might have had such a project. And I think Nietzsche, I think I've presented a cogent case for this, was not simply thinking as a philosopher. In some sense, his concern with the eternal recurrence unifies the artist, the priest, and the philosopher within Nietzsche. Remember those are the three types that Nietzsche talks about in Schopenhauer's Educator essay of these elevations of man. Kaufman says that to make eternal return into a doctrine makes it something rigid, and yet from Nietzsche's notes we have some indication that he's perfectly aware of what he was doing in seeking out a religious doctrine, and also the rigidity comment, or turning it into a crudity. There's a section where Nietzsche uses the language of transforming becoming into being. That is to say, taking a world that arises and passes away and has never ceased from doing either, and forming an image of it, and presenting this image as something which itself never arises or passes away. And I should clarify what I mean by that. So Nietzsche is attempting a Heraclitean representation of the world in which the very fabric of being is presented as becoming, not something of stasis or of eternal duration or undividedness, but change and flux and so on. This is inherently, though, what would we say? It's a form of contradiction, isn't it? Because one way of stating it would be that Nietzsche is attempting to make change itself into an eternal truth. The paradox in Nietzsche's thinking is even deeper still than that, though, for he simultaneously wishes to embrace this ever-dynamic picture of the world, which is the world full of fleeting things. We might say the this too shall pass world. But he also wishes to recast it as an everything is eternal world. And so what he's doing, he's combining the concept of the endless flux of all phenomena with the concept of eternity. And so in doing this, he's actually refuting fleetingness with the idea of endless repetition. There's a note in Will to Power that explains this from the notebooks of 1883 to 1885, number 617, which I will abridge and quote a few sections from, skipping over large chunks. You can say that what the internet's done to my brain. It's like I'm going to post. All right, so Will to Power 617, quote, "To impose upon becoming the character of being, that is the supreme will to power. That everything recurs is the closest approximation of a world of becoming to a world of being. High point of the mediation." End quote. He goes on to describe in this passage, which is full of sentence fragments. It truly reads like only a note, not a fully developed thought. But what he says is, we gained a dissatisfaction with the world of becoming after the invention of the world of being. And what is that? Well, the world of being is the world of gods, the laws of nature, Platonic ideas, formulas, this abstract and intellectual world of either spirits or immaterial laws, things which are unchanging and not subject to the world of a rising and passing away, right? We come to value And we come to associate value, therefore, with these abstractions, because it's in these abstractions where we find what is enduring, because they last beyond any one individual human being's life. And so Nietzsche then writes something exceedingly interesting in this passage. Quote, "Art as the will to overcome becoming, as eternalization, but short-sighted, depending on the perspective, repeating in miniature, as it were, the tendency of the whole." End quote. So first of all, Nietzsche seems ever aware of his own perspective and the limitations thereof, and how he is giving in to the artist's illusions and foolishness. His inner critic, his inner philosopher, always has to criticize these things. He has to criticize his own flights of fancy and, guard himself against becoming too grandiose or overreaching. Nevertheless, let's lay that aside. He invokes art here as the power that's able to transform becoming into being. And interestingly enough, that's the same force, he says, eternally justifies the world back in Birth of Tragedy. He also, in his pre-Platonic lectures, as we mentioned, I mentioned those before, but in those lectures, he classifies the philosopher as a type of artist who represents the world, who represents universal existence in the form of abstract concepts. And it's in that same essay, he classes the artist as a type of offshoot from the priest. And so again, those three high types of men that he talks about in the essay Schopenhauer's Educator. And so when he's talking about art here as the thing that can impose being upon becoming, I think he's talking about art in an extended, broader sense of the term. And so with all those potential caveats, art is the force that can attempt to turn becoming into being. We've done this in the past through our abstractions, through our laws of physics, or our laws of God, through our Platonic forms. Whatever the case may be, we want some definite reified categorical anchor to reality. Becoming itself is always trying to bring forth being. This is its general character, its general goal. Each fleeting phenomena of becoming always tries to bring forth its representation of being, repeating in miniature the tendency of the whole. But of course, that can never happen in actuality, not with any finality. As Nietzsche said before, if becoming could resolve itself into being, that would have already happened. And so this ultimate expression of the will to power, which is the character of all life, is to attempt to make becoming into being. And the term we may use for this is eternalization. And it's what artists and creators of all stripes do. And so there's a wonderful insight here into the nature of art and into the nature of creativity itself. We could even extend it to it helps explain, why do people engage in sexual reproduction and having children? And where people say that's their means of getting immortality. Why do people try to establish a legacy or become successful, and so on and so forth? And so I see this idea, it's the central piece in what I've called Nietzsche's meta-religious project. It's the foundation upon which to build a new edifice. And Nietzsche is the painter of a new world picture. And he's aware of all of what goes into that. He's aware it's an artistic project. He's aware that he has to go beyond the philosophical, go beyond the scientific. However useful a philosophical exercise may be to us for his spirits, however much Nietzsche may have wished for a scientific justification for his theory, he engages in this artistic project in representing a world picture, and Nietzsche willingly undertook this in full recognition of the fact he was not justifying an objective truth. He was not speaking from an absolute perspective, but maybe he could move hearts with this artistic representation. And, there are those of us who dare to believe in this artistic representation. We tend to approach Zarathustra's preachments with a wink and a smile, and all the same caveats about our belief that Nietzsche was himself aware of. And in spite of all that, though, the eternal recurrence, it still intrigues people to this day. It's still, what it is, it raises a dangerous and a very thrilling what if. And, in the study of philosophy, there's hardly anything better than a good what if. I mean, what else are you looking for here? So, Nietzsche wished to transform his own life, solitary, full of pain, and in the end, tragic, into this eternally valuable story, elevated beyond the mere, fleeting meaninglessness of a single lifetime that comes into being and then is gone. His philosophy appears to us, I think, all the more incredible from the standpoint of these considerations, that Nietzsche sculpted a philosophy out of the demand that he love his pain-addled life, a life that many people would call miserable, but he chose not to see it that way. He chose the opposite. It's eternally valuable, eternally joyous. And so this is Nietzsche's religious revaluation, re-establishing a perspective on our lives in the light of the death of God, the collapse of the true world, and what that means, the collapse of being. And he begins with the reevaluation of his own life from something afflicted into something he's eternally grateful for. And so he doesn't pose this doctrine of the toughest challenge to us flippantly or cynically, in my opinion. This was his profoundest need, and many of us today now suffer from the same existential problems that Nietzsche once suffered. It was that Hermann Hesse who said Nietzsche suffered generations before, from things that many of us would not suffer from until generations later. And so perhaps his poet's and fool's wish for this sense of eternal gratitude etched into the fabric of being, written into the stars, can be of value for all of us as well. Maybe. Well, that's all, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another season of the show. I think it's going to be even better than the first. This is not the last word on Eternal Return. We're kicking things off with a two-parter, and it's already been a very long first episode. But I've made a lot of references to Zarathustra as the teacher of Eternal Return, but we haven't touched any of the stories within the text that reference that concept yet. So join me next week when we talk about the passage, the vision, and the riddle. All right, signing off. We began this exploration of the eternal return in the last part with an examination of the greatest weight, which is the most famous aphorism on eternal recurrence in all of Nietzsche's work. The passage is presented as quite literally a what if. Rather than a philosophical argument, Nietzsche puts his eternal return idea into the form of a parable, of some secret wisdom that a god or a demon might bestow upon you on some fateful night. This presentation is precisely why the interpretations of eternal return are so varied, because it leaves open so many possibilities. If we examine the full corpus of Nietzsche's published works, we find little elaboration on the subject, except for a few references or prototypical versions of the idea here or there. For the most part, we find the further philosophical elaboration on the eternal recurrence in the unpublished notes, particularly in the notes compiled into the last part of Will to Power, where Peter Gast and Elizabeth Nietzsche compiled all of the eternal return material. That's why in the last part, we relied heavily on those notes in that section, as well as some others scattered throughout the Nachlass, in exploring Nietzsche's thought on the matter. But where we find further reflection on the eternal return in the published canon is, for the most part, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is in some enigmatic passages that occur in the latter part of Zarathustra's saga. It seems that Nietzsche was willing to spend more time playing with the idea of eternal return in the fictional world of Zarathustra, wherein the topic is treated in the form of metaphors, symbols, stories, and so on. In short, Nietzsche chooses not to spend a significant amount of time in his published works giving explicit arguments. Instead, he makes the eternal recurrence part of a new mythology. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the attempt to create that mythology, which makes it a very unique book. It's not just philosophy, but it's also a work of art. And ultimately, Nietzsche's aim is religious, and so these three elements are what we could say are all required for a truly great work: philosophical insight, irrational creativity, and divine inspiration. Passion and thought unifying in the pursuit of giving some overarching meaning to the story of life. If you've been listening since the beginning of the Nietzsche podcast, you may have gleaned at this point how there are two sides to Nietzsche that we cannot fully reconcile. And so, on the one hand, this is there's a positive way to look at this. Nietzsche fits his own criteria for being a great man, like Goethe, because he has this intense, these oppositional aspects of his project, and therefore oppositional aspects within his own character. Nietzsche's criteria for great people always involves this juxtaposition of two conflicting tendencies. But on the negative side of things, it makes a comprehensive understanding of Nietzschean thought rather difficult. We'll, of course, try anyway. But at the start of the podcast, the beginning of our exploration of Nietzsche, we tended to emphasize the wandering element of Nietzsche's philosophy, his resistance to systematic philosophy, his rejection of absolute perspectives, the abandonment of God, theology, and metaphysical philosophy. So it may seem strange and contradictory that Nietzsche might wish to establish such a thing as a new mythology. And all of my remarks in the previous part of this two-part episode about the religious project in Nietzsche may similarly seem incongruous with that. But this dance of opposites within Nietzsche's soul. So it's not easy to understand, and it's why if someone reads from only one book of Nietzsche's or from one era of his writing, they might get a very different impression from somebody who starts from a different point. So when people begin with Nietzsche by reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and they have not familiarized themselves with the background of Nietzsche's thought, they sometimes come out of it with a very weird perspective on Nietzsche, with an impression of him as a sort of divinely inspired prophet or a Dionysian poet or something. And I should emphasize, he is those things. He expresses his discontentment with this dividedness within himself in the poem Only Fool, Only Poet, found in the Dionysian dithyrambs, where the narrator of the poem finds himself condemned by the scorn of others who declare that he cannot be a seeker of truth because he is only fool, only poet. And in that poem, Nietzsche perseverates over the fact that the poet lies by seeking to cover reality with a veil of sparkly diction and lyrical gloss. This poem is a variation of one found in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it was traditionally appended to the end of the book. So I think it is particularly revealing that Nietzsche leaves us this artifact of his own inner turmoil over authoring this lyrical mythological work, this work of lies, this weaving of an illusion created in order to bring forth some change in the zeitgeist. The philosopher within him, the seeker after truth, must condemn this project. You might recall the formulation we got from Professor Hans-Jörg Müller during the interview I did with him, where he called Nietzsche a post-pre-Socratic, pre-postmodernist. Nietzsche anticipates the postmodern philosophers who challenged the correspondence theory of truth, for example. Nietzsche pointed out that our categories are contingent on our limited, historically bounded perspective. He also anticipated the existentialists who similarly, they felt themselves unmoored from any previously handed down worldview, and so they felt themselves thrown absurdly even into the midst of a life that has no inherent meaning, hemmed in on both sides, the future and the past, by the endless seas of time. As a philosopher, as a seeker of truth, Nietzsche writes in Ecce Homo that his defining feature is that he negates, as no other spirit ever negated before. But in contrast to postmodern philosophy, to which we might say Nietzsche arrived early, there's also a form of philosophy that he practiced to which he's a latecomer, very late. Nietzsche also took some of his fire from the great philosophers who carved out a philosophy from scratch before the time of the great philosophical writer Plato, and before there was any established discipline or practice of philosophy. Men hewed from a single stone. People like Heraclitus, Democritus, Pythagoras. Nietzsche describes this type of philosopher, the ancient form of the philosopher, before the introduction of rational dialectical skepticism that he sees in Socrates, or of the mixing of different types of thought that he sees in the work of Plato. Nietzsche sees this man as a type of artist, the artist who represents universal existence in the form of concepts. And this is the type of philosophy that's not totalizing in its will to truth, which may accept certain metaphysical axioms or certain premises out of necessity or out of even the mere intuitions or convictions of the philosopher. Or to take a charitable read, we could say it's philosophy done out of the direct subjective experience, out of the philosopher's inspiration from the philosophical muses. And so the question then is how to reconcile that supremely skeptical Nietzsche with a Nietzsche who is willing to think mythologically. Well, Nietzsche represents his mythology in the form of these fables, dialogues, and what-ifs. Thus spoke Zarathustra was meant to imitate the style of the Bible, and so the deeper explanations that we receive in that text for the eternal return are not presented as a logical argument. Nietzsche presents his further thoughts on this topic in the form of stories, often stories that are related to us as being visions and dreams, or dreams within dreams. And so Nietzsche is being an honest liar. He's being an artist. His depiction of eternal return is given to us with the open understanding that what we are reading is just a story. And perhaps we could say then, this is one of the great experiments of Nietzsche, testing his theorem that it's not the truth or falseness of a judgment that matters, but the strength of a judgment. Nietzsche wants to know if his insight is true. Can I present to you a new myth, which I will tell you quite openly is just a myth? And can this myth still, in spite of its falseness, change your life? And make no mistake, that is the goal of any religious project, to provide a means by which people can change their lives. That's the further elevation of mankind that Nietzsche has been grasping for this entire time. So with all that in mind, we're going to begin with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We're going to start at the end of Book 2, leading into Book 3. I do plan on covering material from earlier in the book, but the material in Book 1 and Book 2, it's not really essential for you to know comprehensively in order for us to examine these sections that have more to do with the eternal recurrence. Since we are skipping over some things, though, I will briefly recount the events of Books 1 and 2 in order to fill you in on what's going on in the story so far. The story of Zarathustra began with the passage we read in episode 24, The Tragedy Begins. After 10 years of solitude on his mountain, Zarathustra descends to teach among the people. Zarathustra, he's the prophet of the Everman, the prophet of will to power, the prophet of the transformations of the spirit, and all of these grand doctrines that are the most famous in Nietzsche's philosophy. He is not widely understood, but he gains a small group of disciples. Eventually, however, he tells his disciples that they must not follow him any longer, and he utters the famous dictum, "Here is my way, where is yours?" He tells them to find their own paths in so many words, and then he returns to his mountains and to his solitude. A while later, in Book 2, Zarathustra descends to teach among men again, and then he goes with a group of his disciples to a place called the Isles of the Blessed. The Isles of the Blessed are not something Nietzsche made up out of whole cloth. They're a mystical location spoken of by writers in classical antiquity. The Blessed Isles, also known as the Isles of the Fortunate, or the Islands of the Fortunate, they're always temperate. There's no winter. The sun shines at all times. Pliny the Elder says that they are said to, quote, abound in fruit and birds of every kind, end quote. Plutarch seems to indicate that these islands exist within the same plane of existence as human beings, and that they're somewhere perhaps out in the Atlantic. But if you look at earlier myths, they would seem to suggest this is perhaps a location, I don't know, my reading is it's in a different dimension of reality, such, the afterlife or some part of reality inaccessible to mortal men, because access to the Isles of the Blessed was earned only by the most remarkable heroes of mankind, who chose to be reincarnated 3 times. They've been made it to the Elysian fields, and then they still decide to go drink the waters of forgetting and be reincarnated into the world, and then they still live a more heroic life, a life heroic enough to make it into the Elysian fields again. They do this 3 times, and then after that you are rewarded the ultimate reward of the Isles of the Blessed, the Blessed Isles. Plutarch writes, quote, the north and east winds which blow out from our part of the world plunge into fathomless space and, owing to the distance, dissipate themselves and lose their power before they reach the islands, while the south and west winds, which envelop the islands, sometimes bring in their trains soft and intermittent showers, but for the most part cool them with moist breezes and gently nourish the soil. Therefore, a firm belief has made its way even to the barbarians that here are the Elysian fields and the abode of the blessed, which Homer sang. End quote. We may simply regard the Isles of the Blessed, for Nietzsche's purposes anyway, as an idyllic location removed from the rest of the world, difficult to find or to attain, only for the virtuous or the heroic, a place of myth and legend. And so this is where Zarathustra brings his disciples. Some scholars have suggested that this location represented a sort of Epicurean garden to Nietzsche. Here I'm referring to the writing of Peter S. Groff. He wrote an essay about Nietzsche's great politics and many of the parallels of Nietzsche with the writing of Epicurus. And he compares Nietzsche's inclinations to retreat from the world to the Epicurean concept of the hidden life. Epicurus, of course, put forward the idea of the good life, the ideal life, as a life lived among some small group of friends who enrich one another and encourage one another to virtue and to the practice of philosophy. People who embrace simplicity. It's a rustic lifestyle, a Spartan lifestyle, very few amenities, very few luxuries. Rather than pursuing worldly fame or material wealth or political ambition, the ideal Epicurean garden is just a small community of philosophers who live self-sufficient, independent, uncaring for the affairs of the world. People who are living in, what we would call tranquility. And so that's the hidden life, withdraw from the world, go into concealment, live as some small anonymous group that doesn't get entangled with society's affairs. That was the good life. And as far as good lives go, I think that's a pretty good one. In real life, it's quite possible that it was Nietzsche's own ambition, a tragic, unrealized ambition, to start his own Epicurean community with Lou Salome and Paul Ray. But it didn't work out, as we all know. Nietzsche's friends ran off without him, and instead Nietzsche returned to solitude up in the Alps. And what followed was in fact the most productive period of his career. So we can therefore see the parallel with Nietzsche's life, and at this point in the story of Zarathustra, we can see the dividedness we mentioned within Nietzsche's own heart. It's revealed in how Zarathustra both wishes to be a teacher among men and live amongst a community of other kindred spirits, but he also feels that he must go into solitude, and circumstances always push him that way. And indeed, what happens at the end of Book 2 is that Zarathustra tells his disciples that he must depart from them yet again. He cannot remain. He decides to walk out of the Epicurean paradise, and he relates this information by telling his disciples of a dream that he had. And Zarathustra tells them, this is in the last chapter of Book 2, quote, "Yesterday, in the stillest hour, the ground gave under me, the dream began, my hand moved, the clock of my life drew a breath. Never had I heard such stillness around me. My heart took fright. Then it spoke to me without voice. You know it, Zarathustra. And I cried with fright at this whispering, and the blood left my face, but I remained silent. And then it spoke to me again without voice. You know it, Zarathustra, but you do not say it. And at last I answered defiantly, Yes, I know it, but I do not want to say it. Then it spoke to me again without voice. You do not want to, Zarathustra? Is it really true? Do not hide in your defiance. And I cried and trembled like a child and spoke, Alas, I would like to, but how can I? Let me off from this. It is beyond my strength. End quote. So Zarathustra, it's a bit ambiguous who is speaking, what is speaking there. It could be Zarathustra's heart. It could be simply a voiceless voice. But the unnamed speaker speaking to Zarathustra voicelessly, it creates such a chilling atmosphere. It's called the stillest hour. So it's like the sense of absolute quiet or stillness, this oppressive stillness. Nietzsche is depriving us of any of the rich imagery he normally uses and creates this otherworldly scene where Zarathustra is called upon by something without a voice, and it almost feels claustrophobic, hemmed in on all sides by this oppressive silence, really. And so Zarathustra certainly also is vulnerable in this passage. Nietzsche, quite laudably, never shies from showing us many human traits and flaws of Zarathustra. So the character has his own fears and his own sorrows. And this voice chastens him that he hasn't undertaken his duty and has not spoken of everything which he knows. We might consider the story of Gethsemane, when Jesus seems to show hesitation at the prospect of being crucified, and he asks his Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. In other words, please, if there's any way that I don't have to do this terrible spiritualized act of martyrdom and suffering, let the duty pass from me. But of course, in the case of Jesus and in Zarathustra's case, this is not to be. And Zarathustra must, in the voiceless voice's command, lead the way. It's essential that he go forth and preach this truth that he knows but has not yet told. And so this is a terrifying task for Zarathustra, terrifying because it is the greatest weight, the hardest challenge, and he must not only make his own peace with this challenge, but if he begins to preach it, then he has to make his peace with releasing this potentially paralyzing thought upon the world. And remember, Nietzsche believes that the eternal recurrence doctrine is paralyzing to the weak and to the botched. Furthermore, Zarathustra says he's ashamed he doesn't feel that he is yet worthy of the task. But the voiceless voice tells him, quote, "You must yet become as a child and without shame. The pride of youth is still upon you. You have to become young late. But whoever would become as a child must overcome his youth too." End quote. It's the idea that Nietzsche presents of a childlike innocence, childlike creativity, childlike naivete as the best virtue for a human being. A metaphor that he introduces at the very beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra with the parable of the camel, the lion, and the child. So here he's being a little ironic with his metaphor because the child must overcome youth. Zarathustra in many ways is a book about becoming young again. And so it's a story of rejuvenation. Zarathustra's becoming, his self-overcoming, is a story of aging in reverse. It's overcoming the cynicism and rigidity of old age. But then also the haughtiness and the pride of youth, returning to something even younger and purer than youth, the innocent childhood, basically. This is what Zarathustra must become. He has to become innocent of any wrongdoing, any evil he's visiting upon the world by preaching this terrible doctrine. This is, of course, very Heraclitean of Nietzsche, because Heraclitus is where Nietzsche derives this idea of the innocence of becoming, of reality as an endless play of forces which are eternally in conflict and in strife. But none of this conflict or strife does an injustice to reality, because from the ultimate perspective, it's all transitory. It's like the play of a child. And the metaphor invoked is Aeon, the child god of the zodiac, or as Heraclitus says, reality likened to an ever-living fire. So this is the meaning of becoming childlike as a supreme virtue. This is the challenge that is demanded of Zarathustra, and his response to this challenge is, quote, "I do not want to," end quote. Finally, the stillness breaks and laughter surrounds Zarathustra. The passage continues. I'll quote from the rest in somewhat of an abridged form. Quote, "It spoke to me for the last time. O Zarathustra, your fruit is ripe, but you are not ripe for your fruit. Thus you must return to your solitude again, for you must become mellow." And again it laughed and fled, and then it became still around me as with a double stillness. Now you have heard all, and why I must return to my solitude. Alas, my friends, I still could tell you something. I still could give you something. Why do I not give it? Am I stingy? But when Zarathustra had spoken these words, he was overcome by the force of his pain and the nearness of his parting from his friends, and he wept loudly, and no one knew how to comfort him. At night, however, he went away alone and left his friends. End quote. So as I mentioned before, at the beginning, at the ending rather, of Book 1, Zarathustra returns to his solitude up in the mountain, just like he is doing here, but the tone of these departures differs quite significantly. In Book 1, Zarathustra parts from his friends with a sort of bittersweet cheerfulness, right? A sort of acceptance for the need for his continued solitude. Here the need expresses itself as a commandment that Zarathustra must obey. It's a commandment perhaps from his conscience, but more than that, notice how the voice says that Zarathustra, he has to become ripe in his solitude. And solitude, so that requires the abandonment of his friends, the abandonment of this Epicurean community. That's all required in order for him to become ready to preach this doctrine. That's his destiny. It's how it's presented. And so from everything we can see, it's a painful process. There are to be new birth pangs for the most tremendous of all of Nietzsche's ideas. And so for Zarathustra will not become innocent enough to dare preach such a message without further immersion in solitude. And so he has to tear himself away from the beautiful dream of the Isles of the Blessed if he's to progress further. This is reminiscent of Nietzsche's allusion to the Garden of Armida, found in the aphorism in The Gay Science. Nietzsche makes a reference in that aphorism to the Renaissance story of the knight Rinaldo, who was distracted from his quest by the magical garden created by the enchantress Armida. He forgets himself within the beautiful dream of Armida's garden, but eventually his friends arrive to remind Rinaldo of who he is. Nietzsche invokes this story in The Gay Science in order to declare that he himself has often been enchanted by glances of beautiful ideas, but none of them can detain him because he's too committed to his spirit of wanderlust, of never being satisfied and always pushing further on. And so that metaphor reminds us of this situation. Somewhat apropos to this parallel, the next book, Book 3 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, begins with a first section called The Wanderer. And so here the mantle of the wanderer is assumed by Zarathustra, completing the sense of identification Nietzsche had with Zarathustra. So the wanderer was the early stand-in character for Nietzsche, and in Book 3 we see Zarathustra, who is the new stand-in for Nietzsche. He now becomes known as the wanderer, and so this identification of Zarathustra with the wanderer occurs in the story at a point in which Zarathustra must depart from his previous comfort, depart from an area where he thinks he's reached the finality, and he has to subject himself to further hardship. And so it's the essence or the nature of the wanderer and his gift, or his curse, rather, you can see it either way, of wanderlust, never being able to find rest. I'm going to read a very long section of this chapter because I think this is a passage at the intersection of Nietzsche's life and his thought. This is his artistic expression of the conflict he experiences within his philosophy and within his own heart. It doesn't really develop the idea of eternal return yet, but it's the emotional background of Nietzsche cultivating the idea, rendered into imagery. So this is Chapter 3, Book 1, The Wanderer. Quote, "It was about midnight when Zarathustra started across the ridge of the island so that he might reach the other coast by early morning, for there he wanted to embark. There he would find a good roadstead where foreign ships too liked to anchor, and they often took along people who wanted to cross the sea from the Blessed Isles. Now, as Zarathustra was climbing the mountain, he thought how often since his youth he had wandered alone, and how many mountains and ridges and peaks he had already climbed. 'I am a wanderer and a mountain climber,' he said to his heart. 'I do not like the plains, and it seems I cannot sit still for long. And whatever may yet come to me as destiny and experience will include some wandering and mountain climbing. In the end, one experiences only oneself. The time is gone when mere accidents could still happen to me, and what could still come to me now that was not mine already? What returns, what finally comes home to me is my own self, and what of myself has long been in strange lands, and scattered among all things and accidents. One further thing I know. I stand before my final peak now, and before that which has been saved up for me the longest. Alas, Now I must face my hardest path. Alas, I have begun my loneliest walk. But whoever is of my kind cannot escape such an hour, the hour which says to him, only now are you going your way to greatness. Peak and abyss, they are joined together. End quote. Just pause here quickly. This is how Nietzsche views eternal return. This is the reason for Zarathustra's greatness. It joins the peak in the abyss, the highest and the lowest, the heavens and the void. The most enlivening perspective, the most nauseating perspective at the same time. This is why eternal return is a beautiful but terrifying idea. And beyond that, we see throughout the passage this wonderful idea contained in the coinage. What returns, what finally comes home to me is my own self. The acceptance of one's destiny as inextricably a part of oneself. So we see a serenely fatalistic attitude in this passage, as well in that other, wonderful coinage here. What is it? The time is gone when mere accidents could still happen to me. Meaning, nothing is an accident. Every single thing that happens is a necessity. Zarathustra has reached a perspective where he cannot see his life as randomness or as chaos any longer. Now he is aware of the necessity of everyone's fate, which means everyone's fate is indelibly a part of them. And so back to the text. Quote, you are going your way to greatness. Now that which has hitherto been your ultimate danger has become your ultimate refuge. You are going your way to greatness. Now this must give you the greatest courage, that there is no longer any path behind you. You are going your way to greatness. Here nobody shall sneak after you. Your own foot has effaced the path behind you, and over it there is written impossibility. End quote. So that's Nietzsche's self-assuredness in his own future fame and his own destiny here, that he has marked the path by which he arrives at eternal return. And really his way of marking it is by being the one to most famously pronounce it. He's become the most thoroughly associated with it. So it's impossible for any future thinker to ever take credit for conceiving of the eternal return in the future. And Nietzsche was right about that. That's true. That idea will forever be associated with him. So skipping down a bit further, the tone shifts from these triumphant declarations to Zarathustra's sense of anxiety about the loneliness of solitude and also the nauseating task that's ahead of him. Quote, and when he reached the height of the ridge, behold, the other sea lay spread out before him, and he stood still and remained silent a long time. But the night was cold at this height, and clear and starry bright. I recognize my lot, he finally said, sorrowfully. Well, I am ready. Now my ultimate loneliness has begun. Alas, this black, sorrowful sea below me. Alas, this pregnant, nocturnal dismay. Alas, destiny and sea, to you I must now go down. Before my highest mountain I stand, and before my longest wandering. To that end I must first go down deeper than I ever descended, deeper into pain than I ever descended, down into its blackest flood. Thus my destiny wants it. Well, I am ready. Whence come the highest mountains? I once asked. Then I learned that they came out of the sea. The evidence is written in their rocks and in the walls of their peaks. It is out of the deepest depth that the highest must come to its height. Thus spoke Zarathustra on the peak of the mountain, where it was cold. But when he came close to the sea, and at last stood among the cliffs, he had become so weary from walking, and even more full of longing than before. Everything is still asleep now, he said. Even the sea is asleep, drunk with sleep, and strange it looks at me. But its breath is warm, that I feel, and I also feel that it is dreaming. In its dreams it tosses on hard pillows. Listen, listen, how it groans with evil memories, or evil forebodings. Alas, I am sad with you, you dark monster, and even annoyed with myself for your sake. Alas, that my hand does not yet have strength enough. Verily, I should like to deliver you from evil dreams. End quote. Excuse me. So to my knowledge, Carl Jung only ever produced a commentary on Book 1 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. If I'm wrong about that, you can let me know. But so in this passage here in Book 3, it's rich with imagery that would prove inspirational to Jung. And in addition to this, Nietzsche also invokes many symbols that you may know the meaning from based on the way he uses certain metaphors in past works, but that also are sort of symbols and metaphors that Jung would pick up on. So obviously there's the contrast of heights and depths, here referring to the heights of one's perspective. The higher the perspective, indicating a higher level of wisdom or insight. The depths of the sea are also a Jungian type metaphor. The sea is the way across from the Isles of the Blessed into Zarathustra's most dire and serious task. So the way from his comfort, from his Garden of Eden, or if we want to avoid a Christian paradise, we can invoke an ancient Greek paradise instead, and from his Epicurean garden that he's walking out of. And the sea is dark, gloomy, terrible, fecund with evil dreams. There's even this confusion of time, whether these evil dreams of this black nighttime sea are forebodings or whether they're memories. Things that have already happened or things yet to come. And especially from the Jungian angle, you could say that all of the hidden drives and irrational parts, the parts that are buried in your unconscious, these are written into your fate. They're your destiny, so to speak. So it may be that the things that are buried in the deep sea of your unconsciousness are both forebodings or memories, right? We may recognize also the metaphor of the highest mountain being thrust up from the depths of the sea. So sort of a parallel with Jung saying that no tree may grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And so we can see that the heights are the peak of knowledge, insight, enlightenment, and there it's cold. That's Nietzsche associates like the cold air of the mountain heights with like the hardness of knowledge, the bite of knowledge. And the dark, deep sea, whose breath is warm, is pregnant with these evil dreams, absence of knowledge or of self-knowledge. The sea is the unconscious self, the unconscious mind. On a broader level, it's all things in the world that spring up from the irrational, unknowable chaos of life. The drives and the manifestations underneath the surface. And so once again, we have in Nietzsche's work the assertion that all the greatest, highest things in mankind are thrust up out of the unconscious and irrational. So Zarathustra must cross this sea of dreams. He has to, it's a hero's journey in which he leaves his comfort to seek out greater things and cross this expanse of dark fears and misgivings. And so Nietzsche spends a great deal of time sowing these dark forebodings into the story in anticipation of this thing which Zarathustra knows but doesn't want to tell anyone. And, so we might say that Nietzsche simply tells us that eternal return is the greatest weight in the gay science. Here in Book 3 of Zarathustra, he shows that it's the greatest challenge by presenting it as so terrifying to his character Zarathustra. It's his most terrible obstacle to confront. The major character arc of Book 3 is, more or less, Zarathustra overcoming his fear and nausea at the thought of eternal recurrence. And so the next chapter is called The Vision and the Riddle. And it tells us of how Zarathustra, after having left the Blessed Isles, he boards a sailing ship and he then falls catatonic for 2 days in the course of the voyage. The sailors apparently all know who Zarathustra is, and they are curious and excited about him, and when he awakes, he tells his audience of the vision he had while he was in his deaf, mute state for the past 2 days. Quote, "To you alone I tell the riddle that I saw, the vision of the loneliest. Not long ago I walked gloomily through the deadly pallor of dusk, gloomy and hard, with lips pressed together. Not only one sun had set for me. A path that ascended defiantly through stones, malicious, lonely, not cheered by herb or shrub. A mountain path crunched under the defiance of my foot. Striding silently over the mocking clatter of pebbles, crushing the rock that made it slip, my foot forced its way upward, defying the spirit that drew it downward toward the abyss, the spirit of gravity, my devil and arch enemy. upward, although he sat on me, half dwarf, half mole, lame, making lame, dripping lead into my ear, leaden thoughts into my brain. End quote. So to interject here, so like other religions, Christianity has Lucifer, Zoroastrianism, the religion that Zarathustra's character is based on the prophet of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism has Ahriman, Buddhism has Mara, and so on. So Nietzsche creates a devil of his own to tempt and to oppose his central figure. And the devil in his myth is the spirit of gravity. In the popular consciousness, everyone has a devil and an angel on each shoulder. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra's dream vision shows that he has this devil, this spirit of gravity, riding on his back. He's a force pushing him down, burdening him, pushing against Zarathustra's ascent, wishing to drive Zarathustra down to the abyss, to that royal of unconscious feelings, away from this dangerous but exhilarating height that Zarathustra is seeking. And so the spirit of gravity drips lead, the heaviest metal, into Zarathustra's ear, symbolizing heavy thoughts seeping into one's mind as a result of world weariness. And so that is what the spirit of gravity ultimately signifies, is world weariness. The devil in Nietzsche's religion is, so Nietzsche's value system is based on worldliness, as we talked about last time, on an embrace of the natural world. And what is the natural world? It's will to power. What does Nietzsche say about will to power and how the dynamics of will to power? Well, power is always always going where it can generate more power, right? But the will to power sort of goes through these cycles where there's all these different forms, different manifestations of the will to power that have definite life cycles, and eventually power wanes, weakness sets in. That's what the spirit of gravity is. He's that weakness, he's the world weariness, the sense of fatigue and growing tired of the world. Mara, for example, in Buddhism, Mara is the force of desire, ever chipping away at man's mind, or Lucifer is always like tempting mankind, sowing doubting thoughts, right? And so tempting mankind to choose the world over the world of spirit, choosing the world of the flesh, right? That's what the Christian devil does. So all of these things, all of these opposing forces, they embody the very problem that the religion has identified as the central thing that plagues mankind. And so for Buddhism, it's desire. We have Mara. Christianity, it's you could say the love of the flesh, the love of material pleasures, sense pleasures. For Nietzsche, it's weakness, right? And but specifically in this specific form, in this vision, it's weakness in the form of world weariness. We might say that just the natural losing your lust for life. And so the spirit of gravity is ever on your back, sowing heavy thoughts. They slow you down, make you weary for life's quests. And so again, the doctrine of eternal return is the doctrine that the world as we know it is eternal, and our life within that world repeats eternally. And that's why it's the heaviest weight, the greatest challenge. For the world weary, nothing could be more crippling than the eternity of the world. And an absence of rest, it would become Sisyphean, And so as Nietzsche wrote in his notes that we talked about in the last part, duration coupled with an in vain is the most paralyzing thought, the most wearying thought. And so the spirit of gravity endlessly tempts us to simply give up and throw ourselves into the abyss of self-forgetting, to give up the fight, give up struggling upwards, and yearn for a reprieve. Continuing in the passage now, the spirit of gravity speaks, quote, "O Zarathustra," he whispered mockingly, syllable by syllable, "you philosopher's stone, you threw yourself up high, but every stone that is thrown must fall. O Zarathustra, you philosopher's stone, you sling stone, you star crusher, you threw yourself up so high, but every stone that is thrown must fall. sentenced to yourself and to your own stoning. O Zarathustra, far indeed have you thrown the stone, but it will fall back on yourself. Then the dwarf fell silent, and that lasted a long time. His silence, however, oppressed me, and such twosomeness is surely more lonesome than being alone. I climbed, I dreamed, I thought, but everything oppressed me. I was like one sick, whom his wicked torture makes weary, and who, as he falls asleep, is awakened by a still more wicked dream. But there is something in me that I call courage, that has so far slain my every discouragement. This courage finally bade me stand still and speak. Dwarf, it is you or I. End quote. The Philosopher's Stone, that's the fabled magnum opus of the alchemists. Alchemy was an esoteric form of proto-science that was practiced in Europe for millennia, originating quite possibly in the ancient Near East. There's a lot of misinformation about alchemy out there, or incomplete understandings of alchemy. The most succinct explanation I can give is that alchemy merged proto-scientific investigation or experimentation, the kinds of experiments that would eventually lead to the development of chemistry and physics in their modern form, but it was a mix of that with occult spirituality. And, that included meditation, astrology, all these things. The meaning of the Philosopher's Stone is hotly debated even to this day. Jung has a spiritual, or shall we say, a psychological explanation as to what the stone is, but it has always been associated with being the ultimate discovery of the alchemist, resulting in the attainment of immortality. And so the key thing to understand about alchemy is that it was intended as a science premised on spirituality, on a correspondence between the spiritual and the material world. So alchemy was not about merely understanding reality, but using this knowledge of reality to actually do things, to actually begin to manipulate the physical world, right? Like combine substances, distill substances, and so on, to gain new powers over matter. And the Philosopher's Stone is a symbolic representation of like the ultimate insight of the alchemists, which would naturally mean a complete command of matter in accord with the spiritual and scientific understanding that one's gained, opening the door to any possibility, becoming immortal, turning lead into gold, all that jazz. So the spirit of gravity is this heavy thing, dripping lead, the heaviest metal, mocks Zarathustra, calling him the Philosopher's Stone, one who would dare to try and turn lead into gold. Zarathustra is the Philosopher's Stone. He bears the ultimate wisdom that allows us to turn the leaden, world-weary perspective on life into a golden, innocent, childlike perspective on life. But the spirit of gravity, he takes this metaphor of comparing Zarathustra to a stone, he carries it further, to Zarathustra having shot himself as if by a slingshot high into the air. It's the daring and the glory of Zarathustra, but what goes up must come down. That's the dictum of the spirit of gravity. That's his mandate. That's the limitation upon mankind that Nietzsche's devil imposes upon us, the knowledge of our own downfall, of our own mortality, of impermanence, of the necessity of transitoriness of all things that exist within this great becoming, and of the necessity, therefore, of suffering. Our knowledge of our own suffering and of our downfall makes every triumph taste bittersweet, makes every profound happiness tinged with a bit of sadness. Every great moment is followed by a quiet, perhaps even a silent inner sigh. Alas, this will end. It's a discouraging thought. So what's the antidote to being discouraged? Well, it's courage, of course. And so I'm going to skip a little further through the passage. What follows here is Zarathustra's exaltation of courage. He gives his own little paean to the power of his own courage. He says that courage is his weapon that he uses to slay dizziness at the edge of the abyss. The idea here is to banish the sense of existential nausea with, you could just call it blind, passionate heroism. But importantly, one final metaphor he invokes in his praise of courage is this metaphor here. Quote, courage is the best slayer, courage which attacks, which slays even death itself, for it says, "Was that life? Well then, once more." End quote. And so you may recognize the eternal return there. And so this is the use of the eternal return as an amulet held up against the feeling of sorrow and tragedy. The feeling that all which ascends must eventually plummet down to earth. This is the boon against that feeling, that even in the face of death one can have courage, with the knowledge that this life shall only repeat again, that death is not unending. Merely, it's the final chords of an ever-repeating song. So Zarathustra is then emboldened in confronting the spirit of gravity and challenges it further. And he declares that the spirit of gravity does not know Zarathustra's abysmal thought, the voice, or the thought that, Zarathustra knows but has not yet taught mankind, that the voiceless voice commanded him to go become ripe for. This is the thought of eternal return. And so Zarathustra defies the spirit of gravity, saying, quote, "I am the stronger of us two. You do not know my abysmal thought. That you could not bear." End quote. This is basically, a dialogue within Nietzsche's own mind. It's a battle between perspectives. It's the discouraging thought of one's own mortality. Zarathustra recognizes here how the eternalization of one's life can be used to slay that discouragement. And here, in response to Zarathustra's challenge, the spirit of gravity leaps from Zarathustra's back and he crouches before him. And as it happens, where the two characters have stopped on their mountain climb is right before a gateway. This gateway lies before them on the path. And what follows is an extended metaphor in which Zarathustra reveals his doctrine of eternal return. And I'm going to quote from this section in a slightly abridged form, although this will still be a long read. But here it is. Quote, "Behold this gateway, dwarf," I continued. "It has two faces. Two paths meet here. No one has yet followed either to its end. This long lane stretches back for an eternity, and the long lane out there, that is another eternity. They contradict each other, these paths. They offend each other face to face, and it is here at this gateway that they come together. The name on the gateway is inscribed above, Moment. But whoever would follow one of them, on and on, farther and farther, do you believe, dwarf, that these paths contradict each other eternally?" "All that is straight lies," the dwarf murmured contemptuously. "All truth is crooked. Time itself is a circle." "Behold," I continued, "this moment. From this gateway, moment, a long eternal line leads backward. Behind us lies an eternity. Must not whatever can walk have walked in this lane before? Must not whatever can happen have happened, have been done, have passed by before? And if everything has been there before, what do you think, dwarf, of this moment? Must not this gateway, too, have been there before? And are not all things knotted together so firmly that this moment draws after it all that is to come? Therefore itself, too? For whatever can walk, in this long lane out there, too, it must walk once more. And this slow spider which crawls in the moonlight, and this moonlight itself, and I and you are in the gateway, whispering together, whispering of eternal things. Must not all of us have been there before, and return and walk in that other lane out there before us, in this long dreadful lane? Must we not eternally return?" Thus I spoke, more and more softly, for I was afraid of my own thoughts and the thoughts behind my thoughts. Then, suddenly, I heard a dog howl nearby. Had I ever heard a dog howl like this? My thoughts raced back. Yes, when I was a child, in the most distant childhood. Then I heard a dog howl like this. And I saw him too, bristling, his head up, trembling in the stillest midnight when even dogs believe in ghosts. And I took pity, for just then the full moon, silent as death, passed over the house. Just then it stood still, a round glow, still on the flat roof, as if on another's property, and that was why the dog was terrified, for dogs believe in thieves and ghosts. And when I heard such a howling again, I took pity again. Where was the dwarf gone now? And the gateway, and the spider, and all the whispering? Was I dreaming then? Was I waking up? End quote. So you might notice the callback to the spider in the moonlight, which is imagery that Nietzsche also used in the passage The Greatest Weight. And so there's something very eerie and foreboding about the entire section, and Nietzsche aptly uses the same imagery from the first time he brought up the eternal recurrence in his works before this, or we could say he has the imagery recur. The passage then ends with a memory recurring. Zarathustra's memory, which is probably also Nietzsche's memory. It's the memory of hearing the yelp or the howl of a frightened dog as a child, and feeling pity for it. I'm not absolutely positive that the memory is autobiographical to Nietzsche, but I would guess that it would have to be. But, it's a dog who is frightened at sort of an optical illusion, or not really, just mistaking the moon for a trespasser, it sounds like, and then being so terrified and then feeling pity for the terrified animal. So in his vision, Zarathustra hears this howl he hasn't heard since childhood, and hearing it for a second time, he feels pity a second time. And so now we're getting to the real terrifying aspect of why this is Zarathustra's abysmal thought. Because as you know by now, pity is something Nietzsche sees as essentially a character flaw. It's something Zarathustra strives to overcome. Human beings with self-knowledge, we possess this faculty of memory, and so we're able to call to mind all of our past moments. But these moments only endure so long as we endure, as long as our physiology endures, right? After that, it's lights out. But in a world of eternal recurrence, on the other hand, that means that every memory you have is eternal. That means every memory you have of every fault, of every failing, every character flaw is also eternal. This is the sickening thing about eternal return. And so Zarathustra's method of attack against the spirit of gravity is courageous because the means of attack that he uses even make Zarathustra afraid. He's even afraid of his own thoughts. He's afraid of his own thoughts and the thoughts behind his thoughts, as he says. He's terrified of the implications of what he himself is saying. And we also, you can get the impression if you read Nietzsche that he would have these literal trains of thought, right? I shouldn't say literal, but metaphorical trains of thought. And so how thoughts come one after the other after the other. In this passage, we have a rejection of an infinite progression in the course of linear time, which is to say a view of time which stretches infinitely back into the past and infinitely forward into the future as a straight line, right? Nietzsche seems to believe such a view is self-contradictory, as Zarathustra argues here. He rejects the definite creation and endpoint of existence. We talked about that in the last part, but here he seems to be saying that an eternity proceeding in either direction doesn't seem coherent either. On the contrary, where the eternity of the past and the eternity of the future meet is rather always in the moment. But how could this be the case? And I think, to simplify things, it's the case if time is not a linear progression, but a closed circuit. Every moment is therefore eternal. Accordingly, the dwarf, grudgingly, is forced to admit by Zarathustra, time itself is a circle. And so thus, even within the dialogue itself, there's this surreal realization by Zarathustra that this scene of himself and the dwarf standing under the threshold of this particular moment, whispering about eternity, even this has happened before. This is an eternal moment. And so towards the end of this section, Zarathustra questions whether he's dreaming or waking up, which is, it might remind of I almost said Zarathustra, Zhuangzi's dream of being a butterfly, right? Of course, Zhuangzi has a dream that he's a butterfly, and when he wakes up, he's not sure if he was a man dreaming he was a butterfly or if he was just a butterfly that's now dreaming of being a man. What follows is the final part of Zarathustra's vision, and the riddle or the enigma at the center of it And so I'm going to quote again from another chunk of the passage that I've also abridged, removed a sentence here or there that wasn't necessary. So, quote, "Among wild cliffs, I stood suddenly alone, bleak in the bleakest moonlight. But there lay a man, and there the dog, jumping, bristling, whining. Now he saw me coming. Then he howled again. He cried. Had I ever heard a dog cry like this for help? And verily, what I saw, I had never seen the like. A young shepherd I saw, writhing, gagging, in spasms, his face distorted, and a heavy black snake hung out of his mouth. Had I ever seen so much nausea and pale dread on one face? He seems to have been asleep when the snake crawled into his throat, and there it bit itself fast. My hand tore at the snake and tore in vain. It did not tear the snake out of his throat. Then it cried out of me, 'Bite! Bite its head off! Bite!' Thus it cried out of me, my dread, my hatred, my nausea, my pity, all that is good and wicked in me, cried out of me with a single cry. Who is the shepherd into whose throat the snake crawled thus? Who is the man into whose throat all that is heaviest and blackest will crawl thus? The shepherd, however, bit as my cry counseled him. He bit with a good bite. Far away, he spewed the head of the snake, and he jumped up, no longer shepherd, no longer human, one changed, radiant, laughing. Never yet on earth has a human being laughed as he laughed. Oh, my brothers, I heard a laughter that was no human laughter, and now a thirst gnaws at me, a longing that never grows still. My longing for this laughter gnaws at me. Oh, how do I bear to go on living, and how could I bear to die now?" Thus spoke Zarathustra. End quote. So all that is both good and wicked comes out of Zarathustra in a single cry, bite, bite. So we of course have a mention of the dog's yelping at the beginning of this passage. And the dog we discover is sort of playing the role of Lassie, if you get that role. It's yelping for help. And so this is Zarathustra's, the dog is Zarathustra's pity. It's symbolizing that pity is a part of this, because he just told us that this was a moment of pity from his childhood. And so here he's feeling pity for the shepherd who's choking on the serpent. And what an image. I mean, how disgusting. Have a snake crawling down your throat, and the only way to save yourself is to bite into its flesh, to bite through the leathery, cold-blooded, raw flesh, gnaw and chew through it. In German, it should be said, when one feels the feeling of, the pangs of one's conscience, the German word is Gewissenbisse, which literally translated means the bite of conscience. Nietzsche often writes aphorism where he sort of plays on the etymology of the word. And I think also, the snake, it's a perennial symbol of wisdom or knowledge in the Western canon, going all the way back to the Garden of Eden story, where the snake tempts mankind to acquire the knowledge of good and evil, and not entirely to mankind's benefit, right? And so there's perhaps a layer here in which the snake indicates knowledge or self-consciousness of the intellect, but more specifically, I think it's the conscious understanding of good and evil and the internalization of those feelings. And so the snake, who represents the conscious understanding of good and evil, is forcing itself down our throat, and that's choking us. Because after that knowledge of good and evil, mankind is no longer innocent. Now he has conscience, and when we feel pangs of conscience in German, we feel the sting or the bite of conscience, both of which could be applied to like a snake. And so Nietzsche's metaphor here, if I put it in explicitly, I would say hideously explicit terms, the conscious self-intellect is choking us, and the way it does this is by biting us with our conscience. The snake bites into the insides of the man's throat and clamps on. It's also kind of a gross feeling to contemplate, horrifying feeling. But that's why Zarathustra shouts that word, bite, in the form of a command. Nietzsche loves this type of inversion or wordplay. Use bisa against the gewissen bisa. Nietzsche says you have to bite back. And so the vision, it symbolizes Zarathustra overcoming his pity for mankind, and this includes his pity for what they'll have to face in the challenge of eternal return. He himself feels pity for mankind's choking, its paralysis in the face of eternal return, the blackest, heaviest thought, which are also the terms by which the snake is described. And so then the being who was once a mere man and a shepherd, the human, all too human, a botched being living according to the old value system, because of course a shepherd, very Christian imagery. So by biting through that, the figure in the vision becomes transformed. And so that's sort of a proof of the case that Zarathustra really should not have pity for mankind. This hardest challenge that he puts to mankind, that's the thing that allows man to transform into something shining and radiant, something which is beyond mankind. His pity can't help mankind grow stronger or to face this challenge. It only will hinder them, right? Zarathustra is unable with his own hands to tear the snake out of the shepherd's throat. The shepherd has to bite through it himself. And so Zarathustra's pity for him doesn't do anything. But so there is in this passage, is very fascinating. It's a parallel overcoming that we witness. The shepherd, which is the image of the undangerous, benign, sedate form that man has congealed into, biting through the ultimate burdens of pity, brought on by the harsh teaching of eternal return, which dictates that every failure, every sorrow, every suffering you have will come back to you, and will come back to all beings eternally, which is horrible if you have a feeling of pity. And so the shepherd overcomes pity, and in parallel, Zarathustra overcomes his own pity. And so that's why Zarathustra's wickedness and his good screams out of him as he shouts to bite. That's his teaching, his wisdom for mankind. Attack the spirit of gravity with courage, as he has attacked it, gnaw through the terrifying truth of eternal return. He gives us this teaching out of his wickedness, which is to say, in Nietzsche's value system, which is the inverted form of the Christian value system, it's out of his own pity, which erupts out of him. But what he offers us is the way through that sickly emotion. The crippling thought that suffering is eternal. The salve, it's the chance to become something greater, reach new heights of meaning and happiness. And so it's a paradoxical idea that Zarathustra must, he sort of has to pity man in order to give his inspiring vision for man. But his inspiring vision involves overcoming of pity. And then it's also paradoxical, the solution to this sort of Gordian knot, therefore, that in seeing how pitying man does not actually help them in any way, Zarathustra finds the strength to give him his truth that he hasn't been willing to speak, to give them the hardest challenge of eternal return, that to do this out of his love for mankind and his desire to help them. The only way out of this contradiction is really to insist that Zarathustra's love of mankind, I guess, and his generosity with his wisdom is not really pitying per se. Maybe that's as we go back to the distinction between noble compassion and Christian pity. But the transformed shepherd displays this elevated state, that he displays it with the most profound laughter that has never happened on earth before. And so new heights of pleasure have been reached, new heights of happiness, new heights of passion have now been reached. A deeper, profounder happiness, a deeper, profounder love. The love, the pleasure, the happiness of a higher being. The next better perfection of mankind. That's the justification, the goal, the value of bringing the eternal return challenge before the minds of mankind. But Zarathustra is still susceptible to the kind of abysmal thought, right? Just as he's susceptible to any other kind of human vices that he has to overcome, because, as we've said, Nietzsche's keen to make Zarathustra human and have human faults. It's not essential to depict Zarathustra as a Superman himself. What's important in the passage is that we do redefine things like pity as a vice, something to be overcome rather than to be cherished as a sacred value. So, and it should be said, the pitying person, or as Nietzsche would have it, the weak person, might be terrified of this prospect of the suffering of life coming back to them and coming back to all beings eternally. But this is not really the concern that is Zarathustra's most abysmal thought. The depressing feeling that Zarathustra has to overcome in contemplating eternal return is that if everything eternally returns, all of those weak and contemptible things about mankind, such as the fact that by and large we have been taken over by these religions of weakness, and the way in which that lessens mankind, all of those facts will also eternally return, which is to say, it will be an eternal truth. Man is a botched animal in some sense, and this will always be true. The faults, the failures, the ugliness of humanity, the smallness of humanity will never truly cease. This is the problem. And so the solution to this problem that Zarathustra preaches throughout the work, and which is implied by the transfiguration of the shepherd, is called the Übermensch in German, sometimes translated in English as the Overman or the Superman. We can't enter into that topic in all that much depth in this episode because that's going to be its own set of episodes. But it's important to understand, at least provisionally, how the Übermensch ties together Nietzsche's moral project with Nietzsche's religious project. The desire to reorient us towards will to power with the desire to affirm this life as eternally valuable. The terrifying prospect of mankind's smallness living on eternally is answered and justified in some sense by the prospect of the Overman, who is the next transformation of mankind, what the shepherd shall become. The Overman is eternally in the future and eternally the next higher form of life for man. We get glimpses of the form or the idea of the Overman in the figures of great people throughout history, but as Zarathustra says, he surveyed the highest man and the lowest that have ever lived, and all men in between, and found them all human, all too human, which means that no one's yet qualified. And in my interpretation, no one will, because this is, by definition, a representation of the goal for mankind, which it always has to be above whatever it is that we currently are. And so the idea of the Overman, it involves this recognition that there's no static categories of being, and that what man is a fluid thing that is never finished. It's always moving in a certain direction, or actually rather it's moving in an uncertain direction, right? And so the Overman idea is supposed to center us in the pursuit of ever higher and higher goals so that we are oriented, so that we make the direction that man's transformations proceed in, the direction of that cultivates life and health. And that's why I prefer the translation of Overman to Superman, because it emphasizes this is a thing set above mankind. It's an ideal or goal, whereas the term Superman, well, it has a lot of problems, but you could say it's been ruined by the comic book character Superman. I think for that reason and others, we tend to visualize the idea of a, quote, Superman with all of these like preconceived notions of what we ourselves, who are not higher beings, imagine a higher being than ourselves would look like, right? And all the problems with that. So can we give any definite qualities to the Overman in light of this? Well, it's complicated, but I think what we could say is that the Overman represents the best aspects of mankind. And Nietzsche has his ideas of what those would be, He would probably include traits like virtue and nobility of character, honesty, daring, resoluteness, passion, and so on. And so, in spite of all the dross of mankind, all of the painful averageness that will be etched into eternity forever, those great aspects of mankind also exist. And so, that's Nietzsche's faith, which Zarathustra preaches. Faith in the Overman, which is the faith that all the best qualities in mankind will carry mankind forward in overcoming itself. That these best qualities will serve as the basis for a new type of life for mankind. And that's the only way for Zarathustra to conquer his abysmal thought. Faith in the Overman, the faith in the strongest, most beautiful aspects of mankind. This faith answers the smallness of mankind, that is the abysmal thought we talked about. The highest and lowest things are both eternal. And so we must ask for both of them if we are to ask for life, if we are to demand life. And so the overman is the faith that the highest things in man will be equal to the lowest, that they will be a sufficient answer for the lowest things. And so the potential that exists within us to make our lives eternally justified, even though this potential is only very rarely realized, manifesting in, one or two people for every 100 million lives. The belief in the overman is the belief that these extraordinary lives are like a procession leading mankind on to greater and greater things. It recasts the human drama into something more than mere sound and fury, because it offers us a meaning to the story of mankind. And that meaning of the overman idea works in concert with eternal return. And to put it tritely, it's the idea that you have to live your life to the fullest. In the words of Thoreau, quoted so powerfully in the Dead Poets Society, suck the marrow out of life. Follow your strong passions. Make yourself master over your lesser conflicting passions. Give your life a challenge. Give your life a struggle. You should even squander your life pursuing the things you love the most. And it's imperative that you do this, because the days and years that you spend in complacency and comfort, the years and decades you spend pursuing things that offer you no satisfaction or sense of fulfillment, imagine writing these into the annals of eternity. And so the overman, set against the smallness of mankind, the painful averageness of mankind, we have this in our own lives as well. We have these high moments wherein our potential is realized and wherein we see in full relief all the best qualities of ourselves, and then we have all of the painfully average dross, the normal moments of life, right? And so imagine how terrible to take up however much time from your one eternal life not living in a way that cultivates the best aspect of who you are, the best aspects of who you are. And so this is, again, it's the toughest challenge we spoke of in the last section, but I think it's just important to show how the faith in that shepherd's transformation into something higher, a being who loves and laughs as no one else ever has, right? This is the attempt Nietzsche's making, to have faith in the greatest aspects of mankind, justifying or answering the smallness of mankind. So, we're going to talk about one more passage towards the end of Zarathustra in Book 4 called The Drunken Song. And it encapsulates this, the cultivation of the best aspects of humanity connected to eternal recurrence. And it begins with a refrain of something Zarathustra said during the vision with the spirit of gravity. Was that life? Well, then, once more. The line spoken before the drunken song. But so this song it occurs near the very end of the Zarathustra saga. The setting is at the end of a festival. Zarathustra's partying with some of the other characters he's encountered, and midnight is approaching. And Zarathustra then gets up and proceeds to sing this dithyrambic drunken song. The whole passage is wonderful and worth reading, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to read two parts of it, starting with part 10, which is the most relevant to the story we've talked about today, the most relevant philosophically to talking about eternal return. It also includes with one of my favorite lines of Nietzsche's. So, Drunken Song, verse 10, quote, "You higher man, what do you think? Am I a soothsayer, a dreamer, a drunkard, an interpreter of dreams, a midnight bell, a drop of dew, a haze and fragrance of eternity? Do you not hear it? Do you not smell it? Just now my world became perfect. Midnight, too, is noon. Pain, too, is a joy. Curses, too, are a blessing. Night, too, is a sun. Go away, or you will learn. A sage, too, is a fool. Have you ever said yes to a single joy? Oh, my friends, then you said yes to all woe. All things are entangled, ensnared, enamored. if you ever wanted one thing twice, if you ever said, "You please me, happiness, abide, moment," then you wanted all back, all anew, all eternally, all entangled, ensnared, enamored. Oh, then you loved the world, eternal ones, love it eternally and evermore. And to woe too, you say, "Go, but return, for all joy wants eternity." End quote. So we see here the idea of necessity in Nietzsche's work. What is eternal is what is necessary. And thus, everything that happens is absolutely necessary. No element of reality can be separated from the reality as a whole without altering the entirety of it. If you have ever had a single joy which made you wish for that one joy to last forever, that means you wish for all of your life to last forever. Because if you were to change any aspect of your life, you would be a different person. Every quanta of power draws its final consequence at every moment, as Nietzsche writes in his notes. And thus, every eventuality is something necessarily implied by the potential of all things in existence. That's why everything is ensnared together. To love one part of your life is to love your whole life, in spite of what is painful in it. And that's why Zarathustra, as he says at the beginning of the passage, now for him pain too is a joy, curses too are a blessing. The bad gives rise to the good to the bad, and over and over. And at every moment, the person you are is dependent on every other moment. You either want it all or you want none of it. That's the option. So we'll do one more section. This is part 11, very next part of the song. Quote, "All joy wants the eternity of all things, wants honey, wants lees, wants drunken midnight, wants tombs, wants tomb tears comfort, wants gilded evening glow." What does joy not want? It is thirstier, more cordial, hungrier, more terrible, more secret than all woe. It wants itself. It bites into itself. The ring's will strives in it. It wants love. It wants hatred. It is over-rich, gives, throws away, begs that one might take it, thanks the taker. It would like to be hated. So rich is joy that it thirsts for woe, for hell, for hatred, for disgrace, for the cripple, for the world, this world. Oh, you know it. You higher men, for you it longs, joy, the intractable blessed one, for your woe, your failures. All eternal joy longs for failures, for all joy wants itself, hence it also wants agony. O happiness, O pain, O break heart, you higher men, do learn this. Joy wants eternity. Joy wants the eternity of all things, wants deep eternity. End quote. And so this here, it's what I've talked about before. This is the rebuke to Schopenhauer. Nietzsche here invokes the idea that if we seek after joy, we also seek sorrow. Joy longs for failures because these troughs in our emotional life provide the perspective needed for us to experience, by contrast, the crests. The low points justify the high points. It's what the high points are built on. The tallest mountains are thrust up out of the deep abyss. Schopenhauer argued that within the pursuit of our, desires, there was always the element of pain, because we suffer either out of failing to get what we want, or we do get what we want, and then we suffer out of boredom. It doesn't last forever. It's an endless cycle, striving to satisfy our desires, either being thwarted or getting temporary satisfaction and beginning the striving once again. Nietzsche reframes the situation here. The cycle between joy and agony is in fact necessary for joy to be experienced. And therefore, if you want joy, you also want agony. And because everything is ensnared and interconnected, and all things express their necessary conclusions at all times and manifest their power on everything else, then to seek the eternity of one's joy is also to seek the eternity of everything that is. Not just everything that is in your own life, everything that exists and everything that has to exist in order for your life to play out the way that it does. And so to Schopenhauer, there's no quote-unquote final happiness because our happiness is only found in striving. We're only ever content temporarily. And thus, over the course of a life, we have 100 high moments and 100 low moments in varying degrees of intensity. Saying yes to life means saying yes to the high moments and the low moments. And what Nietzsche says is that he is willing to do this, and that's what's necessary to embrace life. And in demanding the entirety of these experiences eternally, it's a final rebuke against all pessimism. And it establishes that there is a final happiness because all moments of happiness are final. Because what is it to speak of finality if not to speak of eternity? Those suffering moments, those moments when we were less than impressive or behaved downright shamefully, or the moments when we lost things we couldn't imagine losing, these linger on forever as well. And that's not trivial. Those low moments can last years for some people at some times. And so it's not a trivial task to say we must live in such a way that the high moments are so powerful that they justify the entire thing. That's why he addresses his drunken song to higher people. That's why Zarathustra begins by addressing it to them, because this challenge, if taken seriously, it's a demand to make your life into a heroic struggle, and it becomes truly daunting. The tragedy that you're assured of facing in your life will be significant. Zarathustra wants us to cultivate the best elements of ourselves and in turn make those higher moments as great as they can be, make our conscious experience of this life elevated above the mediocrity and self-pity and all these other things. That's the deep, profound wish beneath the idea of eternal recurrence. And this is why Nietzsche was liberated by this idea and was motivated to invest his faith in it, however scientifically fraught or philosophically problematic that it is. The eternal return, even though it's one of the most famous ideas of Nietzsche's, it's not really a philosophical idea. As I've stressed throughout, it exists mostly within the realm of magic and myth. It's a religion for atheists. It has enchanted hearts and minds because that's exactly what it was designed to do. But in the final analysis, what we find that it is at the very bottom is simply a hope, a wish for eternity, not for an eternal afterlife, but for an eternity of life, justified on the basis of life's most wonderful moments. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.